Accursed Space, Mage Saga Book 5, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 1. Carina Lin was hanging upside down by her knees in the Duchess's gym when she received a message via her earcom that the scanners had picked up Lo Mang's interceptor vessel. She pulled herself up to grab the bar, crunching her aching gut one more time. After unhooking her legs, she jumped down to the mat and then walked to the exit, grabbing a towel to wipe the sweat from her neck. "Where are you going?" Atoy asked, hanging from the same bar. "Wimping out already? I thought you wanted to get into shape." "After 2 months with you as my workout partner, I think I'm pretty much in shape. We can't all be stronger than half the men aboard, you know." "Yeah, whatever. Lightweight." Carina smiled and stepped through the opening gym doorway. Then she turned back to her friend and called out, "You'd better make the most of your session. You're going to be on duty for the next few cycles." Atoy's eyes widened in her flushed, puffy, upside-down face. "We found the smuggler's ship?" She gave a whoop, reached up to grab the bar and then kicked off from it, somersaulting onto the mat. "Earth, here we come!" Carina strode quickly toward the mission room where Cadwallader was waiting, though her excitement was giving way to tension. Meeting with the lieutenant colonel was something she'd been avoiding whenever she could, ever since the incident involving Sable Dirksen. But now the Black Dogs and she had the opportunity to take over Lo Mang's ship. She would need to work closely with Cadwallader to coordinate the merc and mage attack. When she entered the mission room, Cadwallader was seated at the hollow screen. He didn't deign to look at her, let alone greet her. Two can play at that game. Carina strolled over to the hollow. The Duchess's computer was building a translucent hologram of the interceptor ship from the arriving scan data. The image increased in detail by the second, refining the ship's lines and bringing the equipment on the hull into relief. She studied the interface display to discover the vessel's dimensions. What she saw caused her to draw in a breath. She had heard the starships that travelled the imaginable distances across and between galactic sectors were big, but she hadn't realised how big. Lo Mang's ship was even larger than Nightfall, the Shura's former flagship. According to the display, it measured 2,889 metres in diameter at its widest point, and its longest dimension was 3,523 metres. Colony ships were supposed to be this massive, and she guessed that was its original purpose. No thought had been put into making the ship pleasing to the eye. It was a mess of bumps and lumps, a bulky, hulking mass of dull metal resting motionless in the void. Most of the ship's capacity would be taken up by fusion engines, but that still left plenty of room for living facilities. The extra space would make a welcome change from the cramped, overcrowded Duchess. Then there were the deep space capsules. "It's equipped with defensive weaponry," Cadwallader said in his usual clipped tones. "It isn't a warship, but we should be cautious when approaching it nevertheless." She sat down and looked upward at their target. The hollow of the ship had begun to spin while the computer continued to add detail. She saw the armaments Cadwallader had referred to, lasers aimed at the docking ports and airlocks, presumably to deter illegal boarding, and plasma cannons spaced in 3 rough rings encircling the ship. These were short-range weapons intended to protect against takeover attempts, but as Cadwallader had said, the interceptor ship wasn't a military vessel. It wasn't carrying any long-range weapons. Perhaps these kinds of ships couldn't afford to expend the energy needed for their immense journeys on pulse cannons and particle beams. Lo Mang will have put safeguards in place before leaving her. If she's entirely unmanned, he might have set booby traps and stars knows what else. I'll enthrall him and see what I can find out. Cadwallader nodded, maintaining his lack of eye contact. "Do that. The Duchess is already slowing down. I'll wait to hear what he says before we proceed farther." She stood up to leave, but stopped. She had endured Cadwallader's behaviour toward her for longer than she cared to. "Look, we're going to have to work closely on this. Don't you think it's time we put aside our differences and—" "Our differences?" Cadwallader gaped, finally looking at her. He got to his feet and slammed his hands on the hollow screen table. "You jeopardised the safety of my crew and effectively banished me and the Duchess from this entire galactic sector, and you think we have a difference of opinion?" She gritted her teeth. "I've already admitted I was too hasty in executing Sable Dirksen. I know I shouldn't have taken the decision out of your hands, okay? What else do you want me to say? She deserved to die after what she had done. Surely you're not going to tell me you would have let her live after she tried to kill a child? There are more things to consider when defying the Dirksen clan than yourself and your family, Lin. The Black Dogs was already on their hit list after it took on the Shura assignment to rescue your brother. The Dirksens must have figured out by now their leader's dead, and we had a hand in it. Our future in this sector is over." He leaned over the table and glared at her. "You had no right to make yourself judge, jury, and executioner of Sable Dirksen, no matter what she had done. I did not agree to allow you to decide the fate of our prisoners. You broke our contract, and now we're all suffering the consequences." She couldn't deny the Lieutenant Colonel made some good points. The encounter with the Dirksen corvette and Commander Key as they left Ostalon had sealed the Black Dog's fate. They had finally escaped the corvette, thanks to Darius's cloaking of the Duchess, but Commander Key would not forget them or their ship in a hurry. Cadwallader's profile was too high to escape the Dirksens' notice when they investigated their leader's capture and disappearance, and the Duchess was an easily recognisable liability. The mercs who remained aboard her were also at risk. Those who hadn't wanted to embark on the years-long journey to Earth had already resigned and disembarked on a backwater planet. Providing they made up convincing stories about their past that didn't include the name Black Dogs, they should be fairly safe from reprisals. Yet on the other hand, many of the mercs who had stayed seemed happy to come along. Attoy, Jackson and Halliday had all signed up. Apparently the prospect of not seeing their families for decades, or perhaps ever again, didn't faze them. Perhaps for some, the Black Dogs was the closest thing they had to a family. It had been that way for her. Even sour-faced Chandu was sticking around, though she was less pleased about his presence, especially since the incident where he'd gotten fresh with Parthenia. The Duchess remained nearly at capacity in terms of its military contingent, which was fortunate. The Black Dogs were dead mercs walking, as far as the Dirksens were concerned. There would be no new recruits. "Fine," she said, meeting Cadwallader's cold-eyed stare. "Hold on to your grudge. I've apologised, and there's nothing more I can say or do. I don't regret what I did, if that's what you want to hear. Not for a second. I would do the same in the same circumstances, and I will do the same to anyone who tries to kill a member of my family." She stalked toward the door. "I'll bring Lo Mang here so you can question him with me. You probably know more about the potential hazards on his ship than I do." "I do," said Cadwallader, fixing her with his ice-blue gaze. "And the hazards aboard this ship, too." Chapter 2. Lo Mang's cell sat next door to Calverley's. The decision to bring the Shura Admiral along with them had been hard to make. It had been only after long discussion Carina had agreed with Cadwallader that they had no other option. The Black Dogs had taken the Shura assignment to rescue Darius, so the band was not the clan's enemy, but she and her siblings most definitely were. Or at least, if not their enemies strictly speaking, they were definitely on the Shura's most wanted list. The Shuras would be extremely keen to have mages under their control again, and Calverley would naturally divulge everything he knew about them. The clan would be very interested to hear all about her and her last known whereabouts, as well as that of Stefan Shura's children. The fact that she had rescued the Admiral from near death at the hands of the Dirksons wouldn't make any difference. Gratitude wouldn't influence his loyalty, or his belief that whatever heinous act it committed was excusable for the greater good, as she had once heard him say. She strode past Calverley's cell and only glanced inside. The old man seemed to have mostly recovered from his ordeal of captivity and starvation. He had put on weight and was looking healthy. Perhaps when they had travelled so far the possibility of him ever causing them any harm had faded to zero, they would release him. Lo Mang, on the other hand, had continued to lose weight over the months he'd been incarcerated. She hadn't seen him for several weeks, and now he was almost down to the size of an average adult male. Next to his brother, he looked positively shrunken. The cheeks that had once been round and full now hung loose, sagging around his jaw, making his large white teeth look as if they belonged to a gnawing animal. Not that Lo Mang had allowed his predicament to dampen his confidence or aplomb. He greeted her with a wide grin. He sported his iridescent blue hat at an angle, as if it were the latest fashion, though in truth the headgear was beginning to look worn and dull. From what she had heard, he passed a lot of his time telling stories to Papu. The brothers would also play cards the guards had given them as a gesture of kindness. The smuggler's apparent sanguinity in the face of adverse circumstances provoked a grudging respect. Lo Mang seemed to return the sentiment, bowing low when she arrived outside his cell. Was his attitude sparked by the fact he'd witnessed her transport Sable Dirkson to her death in the airless void? Carina didn't dwell long on the question. All she needed from him was information.
"Ah, the Mage Queen has come to pay us a visit, Papu. Stand up, stand up. Don't slouch in the presence of greatness."
Papu was sitting on the cell floor, resting an arm on Lo Mang's bunk, one of his long, brawny legs outstretched. He climbed smoothly to his feet. For all the time the giant had spent in captivity, he didn't seem to have lost an ounce of muscle or tone. From the look of the abs under his thin shirt, she imagined that punching him would be like punching a wall. Ignoring Lo Mang's attempt at flattery, she lifted her flask of elixir from its pouch in her belt.
"Oh, no, no, no,"
Lo Mang exclaimed.
"Not the bewitching again. Please don't do that, sweet madam. I dislike the sensation intensely. It is most unpleasant. Just ask me whatever you want to know. I promise I will tell you whatever you like. I am an unsecured database."
While Lo Mang babbled, she swallowed a large mouthful of elixir. She wanted to enthrall both men at once. The guards would have to remove Lo Mang in Papu's presence, and she didn't want the latter to try to escape. She made the cast. When she opened her eyes, the gazes of the smuggler and his brother had become vacant. She asked the guard to open the cell and bring Lo Mang out. The smuggler didn't resist as he was escorted by his arm to her side. She told him to follow her and led him through the Duchess's passageways. Before she reached the mission room, however, she saw Bryce approaching from the opposite direction.
"Hey, I heard we found the ship."
Glancing at the smuggler, he asked,
"Another interrogation?"
"I prefer to think of it as an interview," she replied innocently. He chuckled.
"Just as long as you never do that to me. I don't want you finding out all my secrets."
"I already know them all."
That's what I want you to think.
He gave her a peck on the lips.
I hope you find out what you want to know. I'll catch up with you later. I have some exciting news.
Wondering what news Bryce could have heard within that region of rarely travelled, uninhabited space, she continued taking Lo Mang to Cadwallader. When she arrived, enthralled smuggler in tow, Cadwallader's temper hadn't improved. He didn't say a word as she walked in. He was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, peering at the hollow of the Interceptor ship. Details and definition were no longer being added to the model. The ship's scan was complete. "Sit down," she instructed Lo Mang. The man mechanically obeyed. She set her earcom to record. "Right," said Cadwallader, also taking a seat. "Lo Mang, what's the name of this ship?" He pointed at the hollow.
"It is called the Bathsheba,"
the man replied in a monotone.
"And what defensive measures have you taken to prevent the Bathsheba from being stolen?"
When Lo Mang struggled to answer, Carina advised, "You should probably be more specific." The lieutenant colonel threw her a sour look.
"List all the traps you've set aboard your ship, the Bathsheba."
She listened carefully to the smuggler's reply, which included explosive devices set to go off in the airlocks if particular codes were not keyed in, and the requirement to input his biosignatures to the ship's computer before initiating the engine startup sequence to avoid triggering a self-destruct. Cadwallader asked more detailed questions about each trap, noting down the codes and other information, but she was listening for signs he was fighting the effects of the enthrall and omitting something significant. She didn't get the impression he was. He explained each trap fully. As Lo Mang himself was at risk of death when boarding the Interceptor ship, she guessed he would have spilled the beans about them anyway. She was interested in other potential risks the Black Dogs would face. "Lo Mang, what other dangers are there if we board your ship?"
"Lasers are aimed at the ports and airlocks."
"We know about those," said Cadwallader.
"What else is there to prevent us from assuming control of the Bathsheba?"
Lo Mang's lips remained closed, and he stared directly ahead. She gazed into the man's eyes. He appeared to remain entirely enthralled.
"There doesn't seem to be anything else."
"No, there doesn't," she said, but hesitantly. She couldn't help feeling they were missing something. For the next half an hour or so, she and Cadwallader continued to probe Lo Mang, but they learned little more than they'd gleaned in the first 5 minutes. Then the smuggler began to throw off the effects of the enthrall. He blinked and appeared to try to focus his eyes.
Said Cadwallader. "Time for him to go back to his cell."
"Yes, I'll take him," she told Lo Mang to go with her. As she walked with him en route to the brig, she asked softly, "Are you hiding something, you old crook?" Lo Mang only blinked. Chapter 3. After returning Lo Mang to his cell, Carina encountered Bryce again. "Are you stalking me?" He smiled.
"You're an irresistible attraction."
"So what's this news you want to tell me? You clearly can't wait."
"Well..."
He put his hands on her waist.
You really are irresistible, you know."
He pulled her toward him and they kissed. She utterly relaxed in his arms. She loved these moments they stole together, which were too few and far between. Some time later she heard Atoy say, "You, for star's sake, get a cabin." She was watching them, hands on hips, shaking her head. Laughing, they broke their embrace.
"We have a cabin," Bryce protested. "It's full of kids." "Then do it in the mission room during the quiet shift, like any other self-respecting crew member."
Atoy strode away, still shaking her head. Pulling Carina close again, Bryce said,
"As soon as we're aboard the Interceptor ship, we'll be able to have our own cabin, right? I've seen how big it is, The living quarters must be huge.
Yeah, I'm sure they are, she added with regret. But I guess Darius and Nala are still going to want to sleep with us. Ever since escaping the nightfall and their mother dying, Darius had always preferred to sleep near her. She had never had the heart to discourage him. He was so young and he'd been through so much. It felt wrong to force him to sleep in his own bed. And poor Nala had been a mess of anxiety ever since witnessing Stevenson's death and being trapped in the pilot's cabin with his dead body. The little girl had lost all the bright cheerfulness she'd developed since escaping the control of her eldest brother, Castiel. Bryce heaved a sigh.
I guess so. Still, we should be able to get some privacy sometimes, right?
Yeah, we should. She added, do you think Atoy was serious about the crew using the mission room for their trysts? She had begun to feel icky.
You would have a better idea about that than me,
said Bryce pointedly. A flicker of tension passed between them. Was he going to bring up her history with the black dogs again? She'd thought he'd gotten over his jealousy.
Anyway, with all that space available, we should manage to finally get some time together, just you and me.
Yes, we should. The passageway was empty. She leaned in for a kiss.
We'll need to after we get married, after all.
She froze.
That was my news.
His face was centimetres from hers. His eyes were warm and happy.
I talked to Jace about it. He says he can perform the ceremony. He can marry us, mage style. Isn't that great?
She put her hands on his chest and moved her head back. You talked to Jace about us getting married?
The subject kind of came up.
He chuckled and turned a little pink.
To be honest, I brought it up. That was what the matching was for, wasn't it? To find romantic partners. I thought to myself, mage tradition has to include a next step in the matching. It turns out a mage wedding ceremony is pretty much the same as a regular one. You make promises to each other and then do some other stuff. Jace said he would explain later. The best part is he can officiate. He said he'd be happy to. Who would have thought, huh?
Yeah, who would have thought? Bryce was studying her.
What's wrong?
Nothing. She forced a smile. I'm just a bit surprised. I hadn't really thought about us getting married yet.
You hadn't?
His arms fell to his sides and he took a step back. His happy expression faded to unease.
Hadn't the idea even crossed your mind? I don't understand why not. We love each other. It's only natural we should get married.
I do love you, but... His eyes grew serious as she struggled to complete her sentence. Eventually he said,
I thought we were on the same wavelength, but clearly I was wrong. I've sprung this on you, haven't I? But I don't understand. What is there to think about?
She didn't have an answer. She didn't know if her reluctance was due to the days she'd spent as a merc, when no one got too close to anyone else, knowing the dangerous lives they were leading, or perhaps it was Nine-Eye's warning never to get involved with non-mages, which the old lady had drummed into her from as far back as she could remember. Or maybe it was a fear of what Bryce would be getting into, that he would be snatched from her and murdered like Bar. She didn't know exactly what was holding her back.
I guess there's a lot to think about.
Bryce's expression was a mixture of sadness, hurt, and disappointment. She tried to think of something to say to reassure him, but nothing suitable sprang to her lips. She felt like shit. After all Bryce had done and given up for her, she wanted to make him happy, but she also couldn't lie to him. The thought of the two of them getting married filled her with anxiety. He went to say something, but an alert suddenly blared from the shipwide comm. The Duchess was under attack.
Crew to battle stations,
ordered Cadwallader, his voice resounding along the passage.
The destroyer that severed us from the Zenobia is approaching. Prepare to engage.
They stared at each other. She wanted to hug him before they parted to perform their duties. If the Duchess didn't survive the battle, they might never see each other again. But she hesitated. Their brief conversation had thrown up a barrier between them. She saw the same indecision in his eyes. Abruptly, he turned and strode away, heading for his station. Hurt seared her chest. She swallowed. However, like Bryce, she also had a station she had to get to. Unfortunately, it was on the other side of the ship. She set off, jogging toward the docking port, where she had to prepare to repel boarders. Damn Lo Mang's wife! She'd been the danger the smuggler had managed to avoid mentioning. His wife had known the coordinates of his interceptor ship, and she'd been waiting in the vicinity in case Lo Mang managed to make it here, or in case the Duchess turned up. Cadwallader had asked him, "What else is there to prevent us from assuming control of the Bathsheba?" Not who else. Chapter 4. Carina had almost reached the docking port when, "Brace for acceleration!" ordered a voice over the ship-wide comm. It took her a moment to recognize the speaker. It was the former co-pilot, Xiao, who had taken over from Stevenson. She scanned her surroundings for a place to prop herself against or something to hold on to before the Duchess sped up. Only the handbars lining the passageway just above head height, for use if the ship lost agrav, were available. She reached up, but just as her hand touched a bar, the full acceleration force hit, flinging her into a bulkhead. Her skull and back smacked into the hard surface, and air whooshed from her lungs. The ship continued to move so fast she didn't slide to the floor, but remained pressed against the bulkhead. Xiao was really gunning it, struggling to breathe and trying to ignore the pain radiating from her head and spine. Carina hoped neither the kids nor Bryce had been hurt. What was Cadwallader's reasoning behind the massive acceleration? The last time the Duchess had faced Lo Mang's wife's ship, the fate of the battle had seemed sealed before it had even begun. The destroyer carried a particle lance, a weapon the merc's vessel had little defense against. Pulse cannon fire could disrupt the beam somewhat, and a well-aimed shot could take out the lance, but at close quarters and unimpeded, a particle lance was deadly. A single direct hit, or rather slice, of the lance's beam would breach most ships' hulls. Decompression would be fast and fatal to anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the path of escaping air. Unlike the last time the Duchess had been hit by the lance, her occupants were not wearing evasuits. Had Cadwallader ordered Xiao to try to outrun the destroyer? The merc's vessel didn't have the capability. The lieutenant colonel was trying to reach the Bathsheba. If the Duchess moved between the destroyer and the interceptor ship, Lo Mang's wife might hesitate to fire, reluctant to risk damaging the larger vessel. It was a smart move. In the circumstances, it was the only move. Carina also had an idea what Cadwallader's endgame was. If she was right, he would need her at her station. She was pressed against the point where the passageway turned a corner. Grimacing at the effort, she twisted herself around and reached for the nearest handhold. Her fingers closed around the bar, and she pulled herself against the force of acceleration in the direction of the docking port. She gave out a grunt as she reached for the next bar and the next, hauling herself hand over hand. At the far end of the passage, another merc appeared. He was also crawling along the vertical surface toward the port. Cadwallader's voice barked in her earcom.
"Where are you, Lin? Why aren't you at your station?"
"I'm on my way," she replied with some effort. "I'm trying, but—" The lieutenant colonel cut her off.
"Never mind. I need you there ASAP. I want you to lead a boarding party."
"A party to board the Bathsheba?"
Unless you had somewhere else in mind.
His tone was sharp and sarcastic.
We've taken out the lasers defending one of the airlocks. ETA 4 minutes. Make it.
The comm went dead. Shit. Why her? Why not Atoy? As a captain, her friend was the obvious choice for the job. She hoped Atoy hadn't been hurt, and Cadwallader had another task in mind for her. She grasped the next rung and pulled with all her strength. To run the distance to the port from her current position would have taken only 30 seconds in normal circumstances, but at the Duchess's acceleration she would be lucky to reach it in 10 minutes. Cadwallader had said she only had 4. It was an impossible task. She groaned as she dragged her body forward. By pushing her toes into the bars behind her, she could propel herself onward a little and lessen the strain on her arms, which were already in agony. The sweat oozed from her hands, which also made gripping the handholds difficult. The ship shuddered. They'd taken a hit. Yelling echoed down the passageway. Someone was issuing orders, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. The Duchess must have received some damage. How long had it been since Cadwallader had calmed her? It had to be 30 seconds, or even a whole minute. The docking port remained frustratingly far away. The merc ahead of her seemed to be barely moving too. Another problem popped into her mind. She wasn't in armour or carrying a weapon. According to Lo Mang's responses while enthralled, the Bathsheba had no crew, but his wife would probably also attempt to board the ship. If that happened, the fight for control was a given. An armoury was situated near the port, but reaching it would take additional time she didn't have. Then she realised the flaw in her thinking. She'd been imagining the acceleration would continue, but if the Duchess sped up, that meant the ship also had to "brace for braking," instructed Xiao. She clutched 2 bars with all her might and scrabbled her feet around, trying to hook her toes under another bar. The deceleration hit hard. When the reversal in forces came, her slippery hands couldn't hold on. She flew down the passage, lifting an arm to try to protect her head. Her elbow took the full force of the impact. She screamed as bones shattered. The deceleration was pushing her into the bulkhead, but it wasn't sufficient to hold her upright. She slid to the floor. Her right arm was strangely bent and blood soaked into her sleeve. The other merc, also trying to get to the port, had hit the wall beside her, but he was wearing armour. He lifted his visor and pulled a face when he peered closer at her wound. He slipped a knife from a sheath on his thigh and slit her sleeve open. Bone shards were poking through her skin at her elbow.
"I'll come for a medic."
"No," she gasped. "It's okay. Just..." She ground her jaw to prevent herself from crying out. "Just take the flask from my hip and pour some of the liquid into my mouth," she finished through clenched teeth. The merc's eyebrows lifted, but he did as she instructed. The flavour of elixir was usually disgusting, but at that moment she didn't think she'd tasted anything more delicious. She closed her eyes, forcing away the agony that threatened to consume her. She wrote the heal character in her mind's eye and sent it out. A second or two later, the pain began to fade. She opened her eyes and looked at her elbow. The bone shards had withdrawn into her skin and the wound was closing up. Within a few beats, her arm resumed a regular shape. Soon all that remained of her injury was rapidly drying blood.
"Stars," breathed the watching merc. "I knew you could do magic, but I didn't know you could do that."
"It isn't magic," she said irritably. "Shit!" She recalled Cadwallader's command. "We have to get to the docking port." She screwed the lid onto the elixir canister, replaced it in its holster, and leapt to her feet. The Duchess had continued to slow with brutal force while she'd been healing herself. and the braking continued. Good, it meant they still had time before they attempted to dock. She began to run, pressing her hand against the bulkhead to counteract the rapid deceleration. The armory appeared ahead, the doorway open. She ran inside, snatched one of the few remaining suits and hastily put it on. Only 2 rifles remained. She grabbed one from its cradle. As she'd been suiting up, the deceleration had eased.
"Lin!"
blurted Cadwallader from her earcom.
"Where the hell are you?"
It was a rhetorical question. The lieutenant colonel knew exactly where she was. Her armor would have identified her from her biosignatures and logged her position in the ship's system. "Nearly there, sir." Sir? Where had that come from? She'd automatically slotted back into merc mode, but there was no time to ponder it. She sprinted out of the armory and headed for the port. As she was running, the Duchess jerked violently, throwing her to her knees. Had the ship taken another hit? Or maybe they hadn't been hit. Maybe they'd clamped onto the Bathsheba. She rounded the final corner and ran directly into a bunch of 10 or more armoured mercs. The men and women were checking their weapons and raising their visors. Names appeared on her HUD, identifying the soldiers. Bryce was not among them, which wasn't surprising. His battle station was at the Duchess's airlock, yet she found herself wishing he was here. The mercs turned to face her, awaiting orders. Chapter 5. Parthenia opened the door to her cabin and peeked out. Mercenaries in full armour holding pulse rifles across their chests were running past, all heading in one direction. "What's happening?" Oriana asked, peering over her shoulder. "Oh!" She drew back as she caught sight of the soldiers. "Where are they going?" "To the docking port, I think," Parthenia replied, annoyed. She pressed the button to close the door. "No one's told us anything. They've forgotten we exist." "They have better things to do than give battle updates to a bunch of kids," said Fern. He was lying on the bunk he shared with Oriana, his hands behind his head and his legs splayed out, taking advantage of having the entire bed to himself. "I'm just glad all that horrible accelerating and braking is over." "We aren't just a bunch of kids," said Parthenia. "If there's a fight going on, why didn't they ask if we could help? Like we did at the Mage's Mountain on Ostalon. It's as if Carina and the rest of the adults have forgotten all about everything we did." "That was pretty awesome." Fern grinned and sat up. "I reckon I transported at least 5 Dirksen soldiers." He mimed a throw. Pow! And then another. Kapow! "It was exciting," Oriana said, "until Darius got hurt." "Oh, yeah." Fern's face fell. "I forgot about that." He looked at his little brother, who was sitting on the bunk opposite, playing a game on an interface with Nala. "But you're okay now, right, Darius?" "Yes, I'm all better now," the boy replied absently, before quickly prodding the screen with a forefinger. "I got it! You did!" Nala squealed and clapped her hands. "Now it's my turn." Darius handed over the interface. "Maybe they didn't have time to ask us to help them," said Oriana. "I don't think they knew this battle was coming up." "That's right," said Fern. "What was it Cadwallader said? The same destroyer that attacked us before was going to attack us again. I don't think they expected it would follow us all the way here. Not after Darius cloaked our ship." "No, maybe not," Parthenia conceded. "But I feel so useless. I want to do something. Not sit around in here like a pathetic baby while others risk their lives." "Carina would want us to stay here where we're safe," said Darius, not lifting his gaze from the screen Nala now held. "So?" Parthenia replied irritably. She folded her arms across her chest. We don't have to do what Carina says. She isn't our mother, and anyway, I'm 16. I can make my own decisions." Fern mimicked her, folding his arms and waggling his head as he mouthed, "I can make my own decisions." Oriana chuckled, and Darius and Nala looked up to see what she was laughing at. "Fern!" Parthenia admonished. Then she smiled, stomped over to her bunk, picked up a pillow and swung it at his head. He threw his arms up, but he was too late. The pillow hit him full in the face. He curled onto his side in fits of giggles. Parthenia's smile disappeared, and she slumped onto his bunk. "This is serious. We should be doing something. I should be doing something at least. I'm the eldest after Carina. All the soldiers are only here and fighting because they have to be, because she killed Sable Dirksen." "It isn't our fault she did that, though, is it?" asked Oriana. "I suppose not, but I can't help feeling responsible somehow." "You're always taking responsibility for things that aren't anything to do with you," said Fern soberly, "like you did with Castiel." The mention of her brother's name only increased her feelings of guilt and remorse. She'd been sure for so long that her dark mage brother was the family's problem to fix. Now she wasn't so certain she'd been right, and she regretted constantly pushing Carina to bring him under control. But she didn't think she was wrong to want to join in the current battle. Surely she should support the soldiers. She could do so much to help. She stood up decisively and strode to the door. "Where are you going?" Darius asked, her sudden movement distracting him from his game. She opened the door. "Out for a while. You all stay here, okay? Don't leave this room unless you really have to." "You're going to fight the soldiers, aren't you?" said Fern. "You're going to be in so much trouble." She didn't answer. The door was already closing behind her. The passageway was empty, and she couldn't hear a thing. Even the noise of running mercenaries had faded away. She hesitated. Now that she'd decided to do something, she wasn't sure exactly what. The deceleration of the Duchess had ended with an abrupt jerk. Had the ship connected with another vessel? Perhaps the destroyer? And were the black dogs fighting the enemy? She made up her mind and began to run toward the main armory. The fastest route would take her through the brig, so she headed in that direction. An eerie silence reigned in the corridors. Even the steady subliminal throb of the engines had stopped. When she was growing up on Ithia, she'd read tales of ghost ships, starships found drifting in space, entirely empty of passengers, yet their distress signals inactivated. Whether the stories were true or not, she couldn't guess. But she quickly found herself longing to see a human face to dispel the sense of creepiness settling in. It was funny. Having so many brothers and sisters often left her longing for some time alone. But actually being alone made her uncomfortable. The brig came into view. As she'd predicted, only one soldier had been left to guard it. The sight of the woman was a relief in the nearly empty ship, and Parthenia wasn't worried about what was bound to happen next. "Hey!" the guard called out as Parthenia rapidly approached her. "Where are you going?" "Hi," she replied, giving a small wave. "I won't be long." "Won't be long doing what? You can't." Parthenia reached her and sped right past the woman and into the brig. "Just passing through," she said cheerily over her shoulder. She caught a glimpse of Lomang and his brother, and the Shura Admiral, Calverley, in the neighbouring cell, staring at her as she flitted by. Then she was through. The guard hadn't had time to react, and, after all, the woman couldn't fire on a child, could she? A minute or so later she arrived at the armory, breathless. She was confident her armour would still be in storage here. It had been specially made for her for the mission to Ostalon and wouldn't fit anyone else. Though she was keen to join in the battle, even she knew it would be foolish to enter it wearing no armour. She stepped through the entrance and then jumped in surprise as she spotted a large, tall, dark figure standing with his back to her, rummaging in a storage unit. She had expected the place to be empty, like most of the rest of the ship. "Jace!" she exclaimed. "You gave me a shock." He turned to face her.
"Parthenia, what are you doing here?"
Would he disapprove of her plan? Probably. I could ask you the same question.
"I'm looking for armour. Cadwallader told me to stay put, but I feel useless and pathetic sitting around while others are fighting. Which is why you're here, isn't it?"
His final utterance was a statement, not a question. His gaze was fixed on her, stern beneath his black, bushy eyebrows. She wilted a little under his stare, but then she rallied. She liked Jace a lot, and she had plenty of respect for him. She'd spent many long hours with him learning about mage lore during their weeks of journeying. But at the end of the day, he wasn't her father, and so he had no right to tell her what to do. "What if I am?" She marched into the room and over to a cupboard where the children's armour was stored. Carefully avoiding eye contact, she pressed her hand on the plate to open the door and took out her armour. The maid remained silent as she emptied her flask of elixir into the suit's reservoir. Perhaps he was weighing his words. Finally he said,
"Parthenia, it would be remiss of me to allow you to take part in—"
"Then it's just as well you don't get a say in the matter." She slipped off her shoes and stepped into her suit's legs and boots. Inwardly she was wincing at her defiant words. She didn't want to offend Jace, but on the other hand, she had to make it clear she wouldn't let him order her around. Unexpectedly, Jace snorted with laughter.
"I can tell you and Carina are related."
"I don't know what that's supposed to mean." She and her older sister were not alike. Carina was bossy and opinionated, and not similar to her at all. She pushed her arms into her armour and hefted it over her shoulders. As the edges of the front came together, they automatically joined and sealed. Rather than answering her, Jace only scanned the storage unit and sighed.
"I'm not going to find anything for me to wear. There's hardly anything left, and what's here is too small."
"Then it wouldn't be wise for you to accompany me," she said sweetly. The mage rolled his eyes.
"Are your brothers and sisters alone?"
"Yes, I had to leave them, but they should be okay. Darius is a force to be reckoned with all by himself." She put on her helmet and it locked into place.
"Nonetheless, I think I'll go stay with them. It'll be something useful for me to do, and if the battle goes badly, they might need me."
"The battle won't go badly." She grabbed a pulse rifle. "Not now Carina and I are fighting on our side." Chapter 6. Carina carefully copied the first 2 lines of digits displayed on her HUD onto the keypad in the Bathsheba's airlock. The numbers comprised one of the codes Lo Mang had given while enthralled, and it was supposed to correspond with this particular entry point. If she got the numbers wrong, or if Lo Mang had managed to fight off the effects of the cast and tell them the wrong number, the airlock would explode. Given time, they might have found the explosive devices and disarmed them, but they didn't have time. Lo Mang's wife was bearing down on them in her destroyer. At any moment she might attempt to blast the Duchess away from the prized interceptor ship, or she might board the Bathsheba herself. She might know about the various booby traps Lo Mang had set and how to circumvent them. Mercs crowded behind Carina, waiting to enter the foreign ship and defend it. She glanced at the 20 or so men and women Cadwallader had assigned to the task. Beyond them she could see more arriving. It looked like the lieutenant colonel had committed most of the black dogs to the effort. His decision made sense. The Bathsheba was massive. It would take more soldiers than they had to repel a boarding attempt. And yet, "Return to the Duchess," she ordered. "All of you. Step back to the other side of the port and seal it. Wait for me to reopen it from this side." The soldiers hesitated. One of them murmured, "But if we—" "Follow my order, damn it!" With some apparent reluctance, the merc shuffled out of the airlock. The Bathsheba's entry hatch closed. She was alone. If the airlock exploded, there was a good chance only she would be killed, and the black dogs would survive to protect her brothers and sisters. She inhaled, and, holding her breath, she read the second line of digits on her visor display and then keyed them in one by one. There were 8 numbers in total. She pressed the keys 7 times. She guessed she had to be inputting the digits correctly or she would have set off the explosives. A bead of sweat crawled down the side of her face. Every muscle in her body tight, she pressed the final key. Nothing happened. She exhaled. Then she realized that though there had been no explosion, the airlock hadn't activated. The numbers on the display above the keypad faded away, and words in a script she didn't recognize appeared. Maybe her suit's computer could tell her what they meant. She focused her gaze on the words and asked for a translation. A message popped up on her HUD. "Does not translate." She sighed. All the information she had to go on was that the background to the display stayed green. Did the unchanging colour mean she'd input the correct code? Assuming she had, why hadn't the airlock activated? Or was it designed to be activated manually? She stepped back from the keypad and scanned around the inner hatch for a lever, wheel, or something similar. It was possible the Bathsheba's operating devices might be as alien as its written language, but if the ship was designed to be operated by humans, surely she should be able to recognize what to press, pull, turn, or push to work the airlock. The surface around the inner door was entirely smooth, except for a square recessed area at the bottom, flush with the deck. She squatted down and squinted into the hollow space, which measured roughly 15 centimeters square. It was empty inside, but the base sloped upward, making the rear of the hole smaller than the opening. Puzzled, she stood up. The message in an unknown language was unchanged, and the airlock remained dormant. Minutes were passing. If Lo Mang's wife intended to board the Bathsheba, she could be inside by now. It was vital the black dogs gained entry immediately. But how? The pressure of so many people depending on her was building up. She began to grow angry. She had done what was required. Why wasn't the airlock working? "Come on," she muttered, and thumped the closed hatch with a fist. She brought up the code on her HUD again and pressed the key of the first digit, but the number didn't appear on the display. The message remained stubbornly in place. Shit! Was the code she'd input right or wrong? What was the message saying? Was it a warning telling her to leave? She had to get inside the Bathsheba, or Lo Mang's wife would get control. Anger and frustration boiled up, and she kicked the hatch. Her leg muscles jarred as her boot impacted the hard surface. Cursing, she looked up and down the entrance to the Intersector ship again. Her gaze alighted on the recess in the bulkhead, and suddenly something clicked. The hole was roughly the width and height of a booted human foot. The inclined base could be a kind of lever. She put her right foot inside the hole, but before she pressed down, she paused. What if attempting to activate the airlock after inputting the wrong code would trigger the explosives? She cursed once more. If she didn't try, their cause was lost anyway. She trod on the base of the hole. It depressed, and she was surrounded by the sound of valves opening and air hissing. The tension in her muscles released all at once. It was as much as she could do to remain upright. She leaned her forearms against the hatch and rested her head between them. Then she remembered her task wasn't over yet. Far from it. She ran to the other end of the airlock and opened the portal to the Duchess. "We're in," she said to her troops. "Search and secure the ship in your fire teams." The atmosphere in the merc's vessel had flooded the Bathsheba's airlock when the ships had first connected. The airlock sensors would detect the existing air pressure and a thunk behind her signaled a hatch opening. She swung around. The hatch slid to one side and she got her first view of the interior of the Intersector ship. All was dark inside the Bathsheba, though the light cast from the Duchess and the merc's helmets reflected from shiny metallic surfaces. Through the figures of soldiers pouring into the ship, she also thought she could make out contoured glass structures. A brilliant flash in the darkness suddenly revealed the Bathsheba's innards in stark relief, like lightning illuminating a landscape, but she had no time to process what she'd seen. The flash had been a pulse round. The black dogs were under attack. Chapter 7. Mercenaries were running into the other ship. Parthenia's guess had been correct. The Duchess's docking port was open, and glimpses of another vessel were visible through it, between the figures of the soldiers. A battle was going on. She had seen enough fighting over the previous few months to recognize the intermittent flashes of pulse fire, and her helmet's audio was picking up its signature hiss and fizz. The battle seemed to have only just started. Black dogs were still pouring through the portal. She ran to the end of the line of soldiers waiting to join in, hoping she wouldn't be noticed, and ordered to return to her cabin. The man she stood behind turned around and glanced at her, but if he realized she wasn't one of the regular mercenaries, he didn't say or do anything about it. The front of the line jerked into action, and seconds later the movement reached the end. Parthenia found herself jogging into the darkness of the other ship. Her visor's night vision activated, and she was surrounded by a confusing scene of moving ghostly figures and bursts of light. Her group took up a position at the rear, only a little way beyond the entrance to the new ship. Perhaps they were waiting for further orders. She stuck close to the soldier nearest her while she tried to figure out what was going on and how she could help. She would have to be careful not to mistakenly cast at someone on her own side. The black dogs' HUDs would show the status of any soldier that came into view, whether they were friendly or hostile, but her suit was not connected to the battle comm system. The pulse fire intensified, and in the increased light she began to make some sense of her surroundings. The enemy ship was huge. She hadn't noticed until the new illumination revealed it, but the ceiling hung tens of meters overhead. The fighting seemed to be taking place in a chamber equally as wide, though it was hard to be sure. Pulse fire was reflecting from the walls, along with the figures of soldiers, making it difficult to judge distances. She shifted her position slightly to give herself a better view. The oval glass coverings of 1,000 or more receptacles protruded from the walls and rose in ranks almost to the ceiling. A walkway ran in front of each row above floor level. Square patches of darkness below the first walkway suggested exits to the large chamber. She was no expert on starships, but this didn't look anything like her expectation of a destroyer, which could only mean they were aboard the Intersector ship. From what she could tell, the black dogs were trying to reach the exits and, presumably, get deeper inside, and the enemy was trying to stop them. She could definitely lend her side a hand. She sucked elixir through the tube in her suit and cast enthrall on a soldier she was confident wasn't a black dog. The man stopped firing. His arms relaxed and his weapon hung loose in his hands. She took another drink of elixir and focused on his neighbour, but before she could cast, her new target noticed the enthralled soldier. He nudged him with his elbow, and the man raised his rifle and began firing again. Damn it! That was the problem with enthrall. The person affected would obey whatever command they were given. The neighbour must have calmed the first soldier and told him to shoot. Who he would fire at was unpredictable, but he was essentially back in action. Her next option was to transport the enemy, but she wasn't sure where to transport them to. She could either put them into space or elsewhere on the interceptor ship. If she put them into space, they might not survive. They were wearing armour, not EVA suits. Though she wanted to help, she quailed at the idea of actually killing someone, and transporting them elsewhere on the ship would mean creating a threat lying in wait for the black dogs. As she was trying to figure out what to do, more enemy soldiers arrived, racing into the chamber. The pulse fire escalated as the mercs tried to push forward. The atmosphere was bright with constant flashes, but, save for the soft buzz of rounds and the movements of the soldiers, it was oddly quiet. All commands and cries of those hit were confined behind the dark visors of their helmets. Yet more of the enemy arrived. The mercs were becoming outnumbered. Despite their best efforts, they started to fall. The front line was being forced back. If the black dogs didn't gain control of the ship, their plan would fail. They would have to remain in the sector where the Dirksons wanted their blood. Carina would have to abandon her dream of travelling to Earth. Worse, the enemy soldiers could push all the way into the Duchess and take the merc's ship. That would be a disaster. She had to do something. She had an idea. The cast was one she'd rarely practiced, let alone used, but she knew the character, and if her idea didn't work, she didn't think it would cause any harm. The problem was timing. The damned lag meant she would have to cast randomly and hope for the best. She closed her eyes, wrote the character in her mind, and sent it out. She opened her eyes. Nothing seemed to happen. Disappointment and fear settled on her. She'd thought the cast would have some effect at least, not nothing at all, and in the short time it had taken her to perform it, more mercs had fallen and the enemy had edged closer. Then it hit her. She had waited so long after swallowing elixir, it had probably lost its efficacy. There was no way to find out except try again. Brilliant light burst in her vision, and the man she was sheltering near fell sideways onto her. She grunted as his heavy figure impacted her small frame. He had been hit by a stray pulse round that had made it through to the back line. She pushed him with her shoulder, and he managed to straighten up, moving off her. Parthenia sucked up a mouthful of elixir and swallowed it. Again, she wrote the character. Again, she sent it out in the direction of a section of enemy fire. As she opened her eyes, the cast hit. Almost too fast to see, the pulses flashing from the enemy's rifles hit an invisible barrier. Some appeared to disintegrate and scatter. Others bounced off it. She'd done it. She'd only known that repulse could deflect casts. The idea that it could be used against pulse rounds had been a pure guess, but it had actually worked. Some rounds had even rebounded at the enemy soldiers. They stopped firing and seemed confused, turning their heads toward each other as if checking they'd all noticed the same thing. The black dogs who had been targeting that section seemed similarly nonplussed. Their firing slackened along with that of their antagonists, but the brief lull was soon over. Parthenia surveyed the battle, trying to discern the spot where the mercenaries were pressed the hardest. When she found it, she took a drink of elixir and then closed her eyes. She was in the middle of writing the repulse character when someone roughly shook her shoulder, startling her. The character faded, half-drawn, and she opened her eyes to see a soldier. "Parthenia!" came Carina's voice over her comm. "I guessed it might be you who pulled that stunt. Did you repulse those rounds?" "Yes, I did." "What the hell are you doing here? Get back to the ship." "Huh? No, I'm staying here. I want to help." "It's far too dangerous. This is a battle for Star's sake. You could be killed. Go back to our cabin and stay there. That's an order." "You can't tell me what to do. Just watch me. This isn't the place for an argument. If you don't go right now, I'll order Halliday here to pick you up and carry you back. And that'll take a valuable soldier away from the battle." Parthenia noted her older sister wasn't threatening to enthrall her, as she'd done in the past, but she seemed determined to make her leave, despite the fact she'd clearly demonstrated her worth. "I'm valuable," she protested, anger building. She was too old to be bossed around, especially by someone only a few years older than her. "You wanted us with you on Ostalon when—" "Leave! Now!" Parthenia was furious. How dare Carina speak to her like that? But if she knew anything about her sister, once she'd set her mind on something, she would follow through, no matter what. If she didn't go, Carina really would tell someone to manhandle her out of the place, and that would be humiliating beyond belief. "I hate you! I hate you! And the first chance I get, I'm leaving. I'll go so far away, I'll never have to see your face again." She turned and stalked from the chamber. Chapter 8. Carina watched her sister until she disappeared into the Bathsheba's airlock. Idiot! Why couldn't she understand this was no place for a 16-year-old? When she'd first noticed the weird behavior of the pulse rounds, she'd been as confused and amazed as everyone else. It was only when it occurred to her the pulses appeared to rebound from an unseen barrier that she put two and two together and realized they'd been repulsed. And as she hadn't made the cast, it had to be one of her siblings. After that, it hadn't been hard to spot Parthenia's small figure crouched behind Halliday. It was a relief that her sister finally left the firefight, but Carina couldn't deny her idea about using repulse against weapon fire was brilliant. She hadn't imagined it could be used in any other way than to deflect attacking casts. Now, with Parthenia's trick up her sleeve, she might be able to turn the tide of the battle. She returned her attention to the fight. In the brief time it had taken to dismiss her sister, the mercs had lost more ground. Some were wounded and either crawling away from the fighting or being dragged from it by their buddies. A few were motionless and beyond reach. Yet more soldiers sent by Lo Mang's wife were running into the chamber from all its entrances. The woman appeared to be concentrating her forces on this spot. And it was working. She had them pinned down. But not for long. Carina calmed every merc she'd kept back in reserve, sending them all forward. At the same time, she began to cast. Taking large swallows of elixir, she repulsed one session of enemy weapon fire after another. She found that, after a few tries, she could finesse the angle of the casts, so the pulses flew straight back at their originators. Their antagonists were being hit by their own rounds, as well as the mercs, and they began to fall. Even more effective than the onslaught of their own firepower was the confusion and dismay the phenomenon sowed among the troops. The fighters targeted briefly stopped firing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, probably urged by their CO, some resumed their attack, but others appeared too shaken to continue, or too fearful of their own fire returning to them. Slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, the mercs began to gain ground. They reached the fallen comrades they'd been forced to abandon and were able to retrieve them, while the majority of their force pushed forward. Carina remained at the rear as she had to concentrate on casting, which left her vulnerable to attack. But, along with the black dogs, she was also able to move out into the chamber. The enemy troops were retreating toward the entrances, leaving behind the incapacitated. She was pleased at the sight of the fallen enemy. If any survived, they would be useful sources of intel. "Car," came Atoy's voice through her comm. "Sit rep." She gave the situation report succinctly, not wanting to waste time talking when she still had casting to do. "Cadwallader had me guarding the airlock, but it looks like most of the destroyer's forces have been deployed aboard the Bathsheba. I'm coming over. ETA 4 minutes. The news was welcome. More mercs would be needed for the mopping up. Carina sucked on the tube in her suit for more elixir, but nothing came out. She needed a bigger reservoir, an inexhaustible one, preferably. But it was clear the mercs had the advantage now anyway. Her casts were no longer crucial to deciding the battle. From the look of things, it would only be a matter of moments until their adversaries broke ranks and ran for the exits. That was it. Lo Mang's wife had ordered a retreat. Carina gave commands to her troops to chase down the enemy. Though she was loath to leave them during this crucial part of the mission, she decided to return to the Duchess to replenish her supply of elixir. Her ability to cast would be vital in the clean-up operation. Wounded mercs were lying within the Bathsheba and beyond it on the other side of the Duchess's docking port. That was no surprise, but she realized with a jolt that the small figure moving among them was Parthenia. Her sister hadn't gone back to their cabin as ordered. She had stayed behind to heal the injured troops. Carina didn't feel she had any right to criticize the girl for her decision. As she stepped quickly past her, she squeezed her shoulder through her armor. Then she raced to the galley, where a tank of elixir was stored. As soon as she'd refilled her suit's supply, she dashed to the shared cabin. "Jace!" she exclaimed, as she saw the mage sitting with her siblings. Before he could answer, however, she said, "Could you go to the docking port and help heal the wounded? Parthenia is already there." "Of course," he replied, rising to his feet. "We'll go too," said Oriana. "Right, Fern?" "No," said Carina firmly. "It's still dangerous there. We only just drove out the soldiers from the destroyer. I want you to stay here with Darius and Nala." "But—" "No!" she yelled, making the children jump. Even Jace looked taken aback, but he said gently, "Do what your sister says, kids." Carina left the cabin and ran back in the direction of the Bathsheba, leaving Jace to follow at his own pace. She had already been absent from the fight for several minutes. Cadwallader commed, asking for an update. She filled him in as she ran. "Good," he said when she'd finished. "I'm going to join you." When she arrived at the chamber in the Intersector ship, Atoy and 10 other mercs, including Bryce, were already there. "It's almost ours, but not quite," she told them. "We're rooting out the clingers on. Rather than retreating to their destroyer, they might try to make a stand somewhere and push us back." "It's a damn big ship," said Atoy, looking upward at the rows of oval, transparent-fronted cubicles that ran around the walls. "Yeah, it's going to take hours to search it." Cadwallader strode in, armored up. "I'm taking over from here. Atoy, half of your team to accompany Lin to search the top level. Take the remaining half with you to search the engine service tunnels." Atoy's dark visor hid her features, But Carina could easily imagine the face her friend must have pulled on hearing she'd been given the worst job. Investigating the narrow passages engineers used for physical access to the ship's engines would be extremely taxing and dangerous. Yet the lieutenant colonel was right to give his most senior, capable and experienced officer the job. If Lo Mang's wife wanted to hit them where it hurt, she would sabotage the Bathsheba's engines. "Yes, sir," Ator replied, with only a trace of resentment. She quickly named the mercs to accompany Carina. Bryce was among them. "Sir," Carina said to Cadwallader, "don't forget about the booby traps." "I haven't forgotten," he replied dryly. She led her soldiers toward the nearest exit, unsure how to get to the highest level. She guessed there had to be elevators, though the Intersector ship wasn't like anything she'd ever encountered. Chapter 9. Outside the chamber, beyond the light that spilled from the Duchess, all was dark. A suggestion to activate her helmet light appeared on Carina's HUD, but she ignored it and told the others to do the same. They could operate on night vision without any great disadvantage, and there was no point in advertising their presence to the enemy. She halted. The bulkhead directly in front of her bore the signs of a firefight. Scorch marks and melted patches revealed that the black dogs pursuing the hostiles had met with resistance. But the fight was over, and the passageway was empty. She was about to move on when something drew her attention. Leaning closer, she peered at one of the scorched areas. "Hey," she calmed her team, "take a look at this and tell me I'm imagining it." As she moved aside, Bryce and another man, Goulet, stepped over. "Stars," breathed Goulet. "How's it doing that?" So she wasn't going crazy. The mark really was fading at a rapid pace. The melted area was quickly returning to its original state. "It's repairing itself," said Bryce. "I've never seen that before. Is it unusual?" She sometimes forgot that he'd only spent time aboard starships since getting mixed up with her. "As far as I know, it's unheard of." The 3 other soldiers in the team also examined the blemished surfaces, running their gloved hands over the bulkhead as it changed. "Okay, let's go," she ordered. There would be time to discover the Bathsheba's interesting features later on, once the ship was secure. Plenty of time. If they were going to fly her all the way to Earth, they had a long journey ahead. She walked quickly along the passageway, looking for an elevator or another way to reach the top level. She hadn't gone more than a few meters when the atmosphere readings in her HUD began to alter, revealing the telltale signs of a firefight ahead. She calmed Cadwallader, telling him about the resistance the black dogs had met. "We're already on it," Cadwallader replied. "Continue as ordered, but avoid the engagement." She reversed direction to lead her team away from the fight. By the time they passed the site of the earlier battle, the bulkheads were entirely free of damage. The passage began to curve and slope downward, another feature she had never encountered aboard a space vessel. She had only ever known perfectly horizontal and vertical surfaces, but this slope was like the side of a low hill. They rounded the curve and the opening splayed out. In the center of the wider space, a tube rose from the deck and disappeared through the overhead. Double doors opened in the side as they approached. Assuming it was an elevator, she ordered her team inside, and the men and women crowded in. 6 soldiers in full armor and bearing weapons were about all the available space would hold. The doors closed. She was relieved to see the elevator operated via buttons on a panel. If it had required voice commands in the strange language she'd seen on the airlock display, they would never get it to work. She pressed the button for the 7th uppermost level. A few beats later, the doors opened into pitch black.
I wish someone would figure out how to turn on the lights around here,
Bryce muttered. They were in a place almost identical to the one they'd just left, except it didn't slope. The elevator sat in a fork in the passage, offering 3 potential avenues for exploration. How big was this level? If it spanned the entire ship, it would take them hours to search it. We'll continue in pairs. If you spot any signs of hostiles, comm me. Don't approach until backup arrives. And, she added, recalling her own warning to Cadwallader about booby traps, don't try to open or activate anything if it doesn't happen automatically. Simply walking around inside the ship could set something off, but Lo Mang hadn't mentioned anything like that, and making sure none of the enemy remained aboard took priority. She split up her team and assigned 2 pairs a passage each to explore, before she realised the only people remaining without a partner were Bryce and herself. We'll take this one, she said uncomfortably. She set off down the remaining passage, Bryce trailing a step behind. The first door they encountered opened as they approached, revealing a storeroom holding stacks of folded textiles and a large printer. After quickly checking around the shelves, they moved on. The next room was also held for storage, only this one held electronics, mostly interfaces and comm devices. She was mildly bemused. The rooms were not secured in any way, so it was clear the ship's passengers were free to take whatever they wanted. It was yet another phenomenon she hadn't encountered before on a commercial or military ship. The Bathsheba was more like a vast but privately owned vessel. At the next door, a security panel indicated it would not be so easy to enter. The door didn't open as they drew close to it.
Does it require a code, maybe?
Maybe, but Lo Mang hadn't mentioned anything about codes to be used inside the ship. The screen was a flat, black enigma.
Looks like we won't be going in there.
She was reluctant to risk triggering a trap too, but she'd spotted something. She squatted down and peered at the line between the bottom of the door and the deck. Reaching out, she pushed her hand against the line, and then she saw she was right. A tiny bit of light was spilling out from the gap, made more obvious when she'd blocked out a section. Whatever lay on the other side of the door, the lights were on, which meant someone was inside.
"Shit,"
said Bryce, also staring at the light. "I'm going to open it."
"How?"
She clicked her tongue against her teeth. "I'm going to open it."
"Oh."
He took a few steps back and raised his rifle. She moved to one side, sipped elixir, closed her eyes, and cast. As she waited for the result, she tensed. The door slid open smoothly. She exhaled and peered in. In the space revealed, the lights were not on, not any artificial lights at least. A high dome overhung a wide interior. The dome was transparent, and beyond it was space. Military starships and even many commercial vessels rarely featured windows. They were a weak spot in a ship's hull, and therefore an unnecessary risk during battles. Transportation companies deemed them a needless expense. As a consequence, space travel generally allowed passengers few opportunities to look at the view. During her days as a merc, she'd only seen the stars occasionally, when planetside during a mission. Here, within the Interceptor ship, starlight bathed the room, glistening on every surface. A thick, shimmering band comprised of millions of brilliant specks, set like tiny jewels in rich, inky velvet, gleamed from above. She exhaled deeply and walked in.
"Whoa,"
breathed Bryce as he joined her. Then someone shot him. Chapter 10. All Carina saw was the flash of a pulse round, and from the corner of her eye, Bryce toppling to the deck. "No!" she yelled and dove down beside him. Another flash flew over her head as she dropped. Crouching, she lifted her rifle and returned fire. "Bryce!" she conned. "Bryce, can you hear me?" A second offensive pulse flew out, but missed. She glimpsed someone ducking behind cover. She heard no reply from Bryce, but he rolled onto his side. The pulse had hit his left shoulder and chest. He reached feebly for his weapon, which had fallen from his hands, but there was no question he was out of the game, perhaps dying. She had to make a decision lightning fast, heal Bryce or fight off their attackers. Before she even knew what she chose, she was hammering out shots. Then she was up and running, zigzagging randomly in the direction of the enemy. There had been no real choice to make. In the time it would have taken to cast heal on Bryce, they could both be dead. A pulse hit her visor, taking out her HUD and turning the shield opaque. She ran into something, a sharp edge ramming into her calf, and she spun head over heels, her back slamming into the deck. She opened her visor. The cold ship's atmosphere rushed in, and the starlight dazzled her. Her fall had winded her. As she sucked in air in a whoop, a dark figure loomed, black against the stars. Though she'd fallen, she'd maintained a firm grip on her weapon. She raised it in one hand and shot the soldier square in the stomach. He slumped to his knees, clutching his midriff. She pushed the muzzle of her gun against his helmet and was about to fire when a voice called out, "Stop! Don't kill him!" The soldier entirely collapsed and sprawled on the deck face downward. Moving her rifle so the muzzle remained in contact with the wounded soldier's helmet, she sought out the voice's owner. A small woman in armor emerged from behind a reclined seat and stepped toward her, empty hands raised. "In front of me," Carina ordered as the woman reached her. Transferring the muzzle from the man's head, she drove her captive forward quickly, guiding her over to Bryce. He was still breathing, she saw with relief. "Stop," she commanded. Taking a drink of elixir, she knelt down, maintaining the pressure of her gun against the woman's back. After closing her eyes and placing her hand on Bryce's wound, she cast heal. As she opened her eyes, she noticed the prisoner peering over her shoulder. Carina jabbed the gun against her kidneys. "Eyes forward!" After a pause, the woman obeyed. "Bryce, are you okay?" He moved the arm of the shoulder that had taken the hit. "Yeah, thanks." He sat up. "Suit's lost atmosphere, though." His visor opened, and he looked up. "Who's that?" Carina was wondering the same. Her captive was very small for a soldier, which implied she wasn't a soldier at all. "That thing you did," said the woman, facing the darkness. "Can you do it for my man as well?" Carina glanced at the soldier she'd shot. He hadn't changed position. "Why would I do that?" "To save his life, of course." "That doesn't answer my question." Bryce had stood up. "Carina, maybe you should—" "You remember he nearly killed you, right?" she asked acidly. "He's just a man doing his—" "You don't know that!" "While she's clearly something else." Carina had formed the same opinion, and she had a good idea of what kind of something else the woman was. She sighed. "Okay," she grumbled. "If he's still alive. Cover her." Leaving Bryce guarding their captive, she returned to the stricken man. With some effort, she rolled his bulky form over. He didn't make a sound, but his arms and legs moved a little. The close-range pulse round had done its work. Grey-blue guts gleamed wetly through burned gaps in his armor. Swallowing bile, she turned her face away and sipped elixir. Moments later, after sending out the heal cast, she looked back at the soldier. New pink skin had grown over his intestines, though they remained faintly visible. He would live, though he would probably need time to fully recover. "Get up," she ordered. He squirmed, appearing to make an effort to stand. "Hurry up," she urged, "or I'll change my mind about allowing you to live." The soldier's movements became more urgent. He struggled to his feet. "Over there, with your commander." Weaving as he walked, and with both hands clutching his stomach, the man made his way toward the woman. In the half-light of the starscape, the two were shadowy shapes in the darkness. There was no doubt in Carina's mind that the woman was Lo Mang's wife. She didn't look, move, or act like a soldier, and she'd referred to her companion as my man. As Carina approached them, she calmed Cadwallader. "I've picked up 2 of the enemy." She didn't want to let on to the woman she knew who she was. Let her sweat a while. "Where should I take them?" "Where are you?" "In some kind of viewing dome." "Right. So it's just the 2 of them? What are they doing in there?" Shit. Cadwallader made a good point. What had Lo Mang's wife and her companion been doing here? It was only by chance she and Bryce had found them. Had they been hiding? That didn't make any sense. They would have been cut off from the rest of their company, and eventually they would have been found, and it was hardly the time or place for a romantic assignation. The enemy soldier had reached Lo Mang's wife and Bryce. He was managing to stand, but he was hunched over. "Take off your helmets, both of you," Carina ordered. She didn't want them to be able to comm each other. They complied, though the man moved slowly. The woman's hair was thick, black, long, and wild. She brushed it away from her small, delicately featured face and regarded Carina narrowly with dark eyes. The man looked similar to Lo Mang's crew on the Zenobia. He was wide-mouthed, his head was large and bony, and his beard was carefully styled. "Why are you here? What were you doing?" Lo Mang's wife's eyes narrowed further, and she tossed her head haughtily, flinging her long hair over her shoulder. The man only looked down. Carina clenched her jaw. "Look, I don't have time for a conversation. You know how I healed your man? Well, I can do other stuff too. In the blink of an eye, I can move you from where you're standing to out there." She pointed to the starry expanse beyond the dome. "And we can all watch you die." The woman remained silent, though she began to look doubtful. "She can do it," said Bryce. "And she has." 2 tense beats passed. Then Lo Mang's wife said, "I've heard something of your powers. At first I thought the report was only the babbling of a fool, but then I saw what you did to him." Her gaze flicked to Bryce. She breathed in deeply and then exhaled. "I believe you." She continued, "If you look over there, you will find an explosive device." She indicated a spot on the other side of the room. "I planned on blowing a hole in the hull here, where it's weakest. In the resulting confusion and distraction, my forces would be able to retake the ship." Carina's chest tightened. "Is the device about to go off?" The woman's eyes flashed and her nostrils flared, as if she were barely keeping her emotions in check. "Answer!" Carina pushed the barrel of her rifle into the woman's chest, causing her to stagger backwards. "No," she muttered. "I hadn't set it when you came in." "Bryce, go and find the explosives and check they aren't dangerous, but be careful. I'll watch these 2. In spite of her natural enmity toward Lo Mang's wife, Carina felt a modicum of respect. The woman's plan could have worked, and it was something she herself might have done in similar circumstances. "What's your name?" she asked. Lo Mang had told her, but she'd forgotten. The woman drew herself up to her full height, which was about the level of Carina's shoulder. "I am Mezban Kabazli Noran, Procurator of the Majestic Isles, member of the Encircling Council, and your nemesis." Chapter 11. Aboard the Duchess, all was chaos. Mercs pounded the passageways, and the same acrid gases of battle Carina had perceived on the Bathsheba permeated the atmosphere. She had sent Bryce to the sickbay to get checked out, reluctantly allowing the enemy soldier to go with him. Mezban Kabazli Noran was on her way to the brig, Carina's gun at her back, though navigating the ship through the racing mercs was proving difficult. Cadwallader and Atoy weren't answering her comms, and she didn't want to stop anyone to ask what was going on. There seemed to be fighting somewhere aboard the ship, which was odd. She had thought the main battle was over. Maybe the Black Dogs had captured some enemy soldiers and they'd broken out of confinement. She hadn't decided whether to put Mezban in the same cell as her husband, but it looked as though the question might have been decided for her. If some of the woman's soldiers were also to be held in the small brig, Lomang and his wife might have to be reunited, whatever the consequences. Judging from Mezban's previous behaviour toward her husband, forcing him into a tiny shuttle and ejecting him from his ship, the consequences for the smuggler could be dire. Yet when they arrived at the brig, its only occupants were Lomang, Papu and Calverley. The reactions of the smuggler and his twin were something to behold. Lomang's eyes widened until his irises were black islands in a white ocean, and his mouth fell open so far he seemed about to dislocate his jaw. Papu, on the other hand, looked the most frightened she had ever seen him, and possibly the most frightened she had ever seen anyone. He darted to the rear of his cell and spread-eagled himself against the wall, facing Mezban with features full of terror. Carina became seriously concerned the giant man might wet himself.
"Not in this cell," he pleaded. "I beg you, put her in with the old man, or take me out."
By contrast, Lomang flung him at the transparent cell wall and pressed his face against it, flattening his nose and smashing his lips until they were flat pink pancakes. He moved his head away just long enough to say,
"My love, my sweet darling, together again at last."
Then he squashed his face against the surface, as if trying to push through the solid barrier to reach her. Mezban murmured something indistinct. She continued to talk, her voice becoming louder. She was speaking the language the smuggler used to speak to his men. She spoke louder and faster, and her face began to twist with fury. The woman's delicate olive skin flushed deep red, her eyes grew fiery, and as she, apparently, cursed and scolded Lomang, spittle flew from her lips. Her tone rose to a crescendo, and she tried to wrench her arm from Carina's grip, raising it in a gesture of fury. She struggled to break free, and when that failed, she attempted to drag Carina toward the smuggler's cell. Lomang's eyes shone as he watched her, his face wreathed in admiration, and, Carina noticed with disgust, what looked like lust. She curled her lip. The display from the married couple was both hilarious and disturbing. "I think you'd better go in here." She hauled the furious woman over to Calverley's cell. The old man looked up in alarm as he understood what was happening. "No, no." He stood up from his bunk. "I don't believe—" Carina asked the guard to unlock the cell door and then pushed Mezban inside. As she walked away, the sound of Lomang and Mezban's voices, one conciliatory and adoring, the other impassioned and enraged, followed her down the passageway. After a second failed attempt to calm Cadwallader and Atoy to find out what she should do next, she decided to pop in on the kids and check they were okay. She also wanted to make sure Parthenia had returned to their shared cabin too. She was worried her sister might have gone to fight in the skirmish that seemed to be going on, but when she arrived, the cabin was empty. She stood in the entrance, taking in the vacant bunks and discarded clothing. Her pulse began to race. Where had they gone? She calmed Bryce. "Hey, are the kids with you?"
"No, it's just me and—"
"Do you know where they are?"
"No, sorry, have they—"
She closed the comm. Her mind was spinning. The situation aboard the Bathsheba remained dangerous, and some kind of engagement was going on in the Duchess. If any of her brothers or sisters got tangled up in either operation, they could be hurt or killed. Damn it! Her thoughts flew to Parthenia. The stupid girl had wandered into a full-on battle. Had she dragged her siblings into something similar? If she had, she would never forgive her. She stepped quickly to a bunk and picked up a pajama top. Holding on to the thin material, she took a drink of elixir and cast Locate. In her mind, the Duchess was a black, grey and white landscape in a lifeless void. A single figure shone out among the many others moving around the ship. Nala. The clothes she was holding belonged to her youngest sister, but finding the girl didn't help her. If she sent to non-mage Nala, she wouldn't hear her. Attempting to steady her panicked breathing, she grabbed another top. She was sure this one was Oriana's. After swallowing more elixir, she tried the cast for a second time. Once more, she perceived the shadow of the Duchess's interior, like a splicer's scan. Suddenly, Oriana gleamed out, clear and shining. Thank the stars! Now she could find out where the kids had gone and if they were all safe. But before she had a chance to cast Send, however, the cabin door flew open. "Carina!" yelled Darius, rushing in and launching himself into her arms. The force of the little boy almost knocked her over. "You came back!" exclaimed Oriana. "What was the battle like?" "Never mind that," said Fern. "Tell her what we've been doing." Then, without giving his sister a chance to go along with his suggestion, he continued, "We had a battle of our own. We saved the ship." Carina remained very still. Darius's arms were around her neck and he was sitting on her lap, but she didn't move. She could feel the blood draining from her face as her rage rose. Oriana, Fern and Nala gazed at her, their excited, triumphant expressions fading to dismay. Darius's arm slipped away and he climbed off her before standing with his head hung low. "What's wrong?" Fern asked cautiously. "Did I give you permission to leave the cabin?" she asked between clenched teeth. Oriana replied, "No, but—" "Did I say you could take part in a firefight for Star's sake?" "We had to," Fern protested. "The ship was being boarded at the airlock. If we hadn't—" "He's right," Oriana said, her tone defiant. "And we helped. We really did. We cast lock, and we transported some of the enemy soldiers, and—" She leapt to her feet. "You could have been killed!" she yelled. "You could all have died." "Jace was there too," said Fern, his lips sticking out stubbornly. "He said it was okay for us to join in as long as we stayed back." "Jace isn't your family. He doesn't have the right to give you permission to risk your lives." "Stars!" She slammed her forehead with the palm of her hand. "Haven't you learned anything from the battle on Ostalon? Darius is lucky to be alive. It could have all gone horribly, horribly wrong. But you—" "I know," she roared. "I know I was the one who took you there. I know it was my fault Darius nearly died." She couldn't bear looking at the scared, confused faces of her siblings any longer. She stomped to the door, pushing past Oriana and Fern, and left. Chapter 12. The soldier wasn't going to make it. Parthenia had exhausted her supply of elixir trying to heal him, but his injuries were too severe. He'd been shot in the chest, arm and thigh. It was the chest wound that seemed to be the problem. Receiving a pulse round in that area had done something to his heart that the heal cast couldn't fix. Her throat tightened as she knelt next to the dying man, remembering her mother. When life could no longer be sustained and the end came, healing only forestalled the inevitable. She'd tried over and over again to prevent her mother from slipping away, but all her efforts were useless. She looked up, suddenly aware that she and the doomed merc were the only people remaining in the Bathsheba's airlock. The fight inside the ship seemed to be over, and the soldiers she'd already helped had gone somewhere else, perhaps assigned new duties. Should she tell the man there was no hope? She trembled at the thought of delivering such terrible news. Yet maybe he had some last messages or instructions to leave about things important to him. If only one of his fellow soldiers was around, or an officer, or even Carina. Anyone else would be better suited to this task. The man's visor opened. She sucked in a breath. Blood from his chest wound had splashed up onto his neck and face, which was also scorched red and blistered. His eyes were open, and he was looking at her. She tried to force a smile, but she feared she was only managing a grimace. The soldier's mouth worked, and his neck muscles tightened as he tried to speak. A few quiet words squeezed out. "Thanks for trying." She could see the life in his eyes begin to fade. Tears rose up, overspilled, and rolled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." "Did..." The man swallowed. "What you could." She took his hand in both of her own, determined to give him some comfort. "Hey, Scanlan!" called a voice. In her distraction, she hadn't noticed the arrival of another mercenary. "What are you doing there?" Without waiting for an answer, the new arrival went on. "Lazing around again, huh? Move out of the way, please, miss." Somewhat dumbfounded by the man's brusque, joking manner, she moved aside. She wanted to convey the dying man's state, hoping to prevent his further suffering, but she couldn't find the words. The soldier squatted down and scooped Scanlan into his arms. With a grunt of effort, he lifted the limp form and then carried him away into the Duchess. She was suddenly alone. She felt numb. How many soldiers had she healed? She couldn't remember. They'd come and gone so fast. She had healed some of them twice. They'd returned to the battle only to be wounded again. A heavy blanket of exhaustion settled over her. She felt weak and faint, probably due to the large number of casts she'd made in such a short space of time. But it was more than that. It was the pain, the wounds, the groans and cries of the injured that had done something to her. Witnessing so much suffering had left an imprint on her soul. Slowly she got to her feet. The black dogs must have won the battle. The vast dark chamber beyond the Bathsheba's airlock was empty. Even the injured and dead enemy troops had disappeared, and no sounds were coming from within the Duchess. It was time to return to her family and check they were okay. Returning to the mercenaries' vessel and lighted areas, she lifted her visor. Distant shouts and thuds came to her from afar. Something was happening on the other side of the ship. Another fight, perhaps. She should go there and help out, but she needed more elixir, and she no longer had a weapon. She didn't recall what had happened to it. The Mage's elixir was stored in the galley, and she decided to go there first. Picking up another rifle from somewhere, assuming she could find one, was probably pointless. She was most helpful as a mage, not a fighter. though her recent experience had left her feeling hopeless. The idea of healing men and women so they could go out and get hurt again or even die sickened her. She walked along the passageway, turned a corner and then another, but then she stopped. She looked around her, confused. She had thought she'd been heading toward the galley, but she didn't recognize this part of the ship. She turned around and went back the way she had come, hoping to return to her starting point and figure out where she'd gone wrong. During their journey to the interceptor vessel, Carina had discouraged her siblings from wandering about, telling them they should stick to their cabin, the mess, the galley, and a few other general use areas. What exactly her older sister was worried about, she'd never explained. It wasn't like they could fall off the ship or be captured by one of their several enemies. She had humoured Carina for the most part and echoed her warnings to her brothers and sisters, but she was getting tired of her oldest sibling's constant, overbearing bossiness. For a long time she had looked up to Carina and respected her, notwithstanding that time when she'd enthralled her, but those days were over. Parthenia halted again, once more confused by her surroundings. She felt dizzy and nauseated. Putting a hand to her head, she tried to figure out where she'd taken the wrong direction, but images of wounded soldiers flashed across her mind, muddling her thoughts. She continued on, hoping to end up in familiar territory, or maybe she would see someone she could ask for help. The far-off sounds of battle had faded. She walked slowly, turning down random passages until she found herself near the cabin she shared with her family. Her pace sped up in her relief at finding herself nearly home, and she hurried toward the door. It opened, and her relief redoubled when she saw all 4 children safe inside, though Jace wasn't with them, which was a disappointment. He had said he would look after them while she was gone. An atmosphere of gloom and despondency hit her almost palpably. The glum faces of her siblings pivoted toward her as one. "Stars," she said. "What's happened? Did we lose?" "No," Oriana replied. "We won. It's all over. The black dogs fought the attackers all the way back to their ship and then seized it." She went on to explain how the enemy had also tried to board the Duchess through one of the airlocks, and that the children and Jace had helped to repel the troops. "Carina found out," said Fern despondently. "Well, we told her, thinking she wouldn't mind too much, considering we weren't hurt at all and we'd done a great job." "Oh." Parthenia sat down heavily on a bunk. "I see." After experiencing her sister's reaction earlier when she had tried to help in a battle, she could imagine how the revelation had gone down. Her siblings' hurt and sadness cut her deeply. Their sister must have given them a severe tongue-lashing. "Don't worry, Carina isn't going to tyrannize us any more. I'll make sure of it." Chapter 13. A pile of ancient documents sat in the centre of the table in the mission room between Carina, Cadwallader and Jace. The writings, charts and maps represented everything she'd worked for over past months, perhaps even a year or longer. She'd lost track of time passing since escaping the Shurers. The documents represented all her hopes and dreams of a safe, happy future for her family and herself. And yet, when she looked at them, in place of the joy and relief she might have expected to feel, was only hollow emptiness. The old, dry paper seemed to symbolize what was at her heart. Someone coughed. She looked up. Jace's gaze was upon her, serious and questioning. "So as I said," Cadwallader was also watching her intently, clearly annoyed. Apparently he was having to repeat himself.
We have some closely related decisions to make, and we must make them now, before we set off on our long journey. Firstly, what do we do with Mezban and her troops? Secondly, what do we do with Lo Mang and his brother? And thirdly, what do we do with Calverley? Do we leave them all behind and face the fact they might try to follow us? Or, in Calverley's case, inform the Shurers where we've gone? Do we take them with us, or do we dispose of them?
His nose wrinkled as he stated the third option. Killing the prisoners would be a drastic act, but it couldn't be denied it was the choice that made the most sense in terms of safety. If they did perform the executions, they would be secure in the knowledge that the former occupants of the destroyer would never escape and retake it. Carina imagined the sight of hundreds of bodies floating in the void, frozen and bloody.
"I'm deeply opposed to murder," said Jace, "no matter what the circumstances, though I admit it's going to be hard to keep so many men and women securely confined." "What about you, Lin?" Cadwallader asked. "What's your opinion?"
"My opinion is, I don't know why he's even here," she said hotly, glaring at Jace. "I'm getting sick of you inviting others to our meetings."
"I've already explained I value Jace's input and—"
"Well, I don't." She gritted her teeth and added more evenly, "He took my brothers and sisters into a dangerous situation without my permission. He allowed children to risk their lives. Those are not the actions of someone who thinks straight or cares about consequences. He has nothing to offer here. If you value the outcome of this mission, I suggest you exclude this man from our discussions."
"No."
Cadwallader appeared to try to pierce her with his ice-blue stare.
"Jace's and other mages' help in the attack at the airlock was invaluable. If they hadn't been there, Mezban's troops might have taken the Duchess. Where would we all have been then, including your siblings? He did the right thing at the time. He also has considerable experience in a position of significant responsibility, and he demonstrates maturity and fair-mindedness."
"And I don't, I suppose." Carina pushed her chair back and stood up. "You're forgetting it was me who found these papers. It was me who paid for the repair and updating of the Duchess. And it was me who armed and equipped the Black Dogs. I have the Bathsheba now. I don't need either of you." She reached out to sweep the documents up into her arms. Cadwallader laid a heavy hand on top of the pile.
"Sit down, Lin. Don't be a fool."
"Carina," said Jace,
"I'm sorry for taking your brothers and sisters with me to help in the battle. I knew you would have forbidden it, and I should have told them to stay behind. But also, I knew they'd gone with you into the old mage fortress on Ostalon, so I thought—"
She looked down, a lead weight pressing on her heart.
"I want Jace here as a balance between you and me. 3 is a good number for making the best decisions, and this is a very important matter. Please, sit down."
The unusual gentleness from the lieutenant colonel calmed her and brought a lump to her throat. She swallowed and resumed her seat. "I don't think holding so many prisoners should be much of a problem. The chamber where we fought the first battle, did either of you take a good look at it?"
"I haven't been aboard the Interceptor ship yet," said Jace.
Cadwallader replied,
"I've had other things to think about."
"To be honest, I'm not sure I'm right, and even if I am, there's no guarantee the system would still function for so many. But I believe the Bathsheba used to be a colony ship. I think the room beyond the airlock is a deep sleep chamber, designed to hold hundreds of colonists." Cadwallader folded his arms and leaned back in his chair.
"So we could put Mezban's soldiers into deep sleep capsules. That would be the perfect solution, though temporary. We couldn't keep them there forever."
"But we could hold the troops, and Lo Mang and Papu, Mesban and Calverley in deep sleep until we're so far from civilization there's no threat of them finding a way to come after us.
I guess we're talking about marooning them all on a remote but habitable planet,
Jace said.
I confess I'm not happy with that plan either, but I could live with it.
The Lieutenant Colonel nodded.
Let's investigate that possibility. I'll tell the tech team to look into it.
He reached into the documents and began to spread a few on the table.
We're confident we have all the information we need from these to plot a course for Earth.
Carina eyed the yellow, aged sheets. In the weeks it had taken to travel to the Bathsheba, she had pored over them, taking in every detail. The star map she had spent years memorizing had only ever been a test for those determined to return to Earth, the place that had been so dangerous for their kind. The papers included the true coordinates of their home planet, but the mages had also written pages and pages in a strange script the ship's computer could only partially translate. The information included their history, their home in the mountains, their fight to leave for the stars, the long expedition to freedom, and the earliest days of their settlement. It had been an emotional and harrowing experience to read about the struggles and persecution of her ancestors. The details she'd managed to understand had been disconcertingly familiar, and she'd begun to doubt the wisdom of going somewhere mages had fought so hard to leave. In the end, she'd felt she'd gone through so much to find the documents and put everyone else through so much, it was too late to back out. Yes, she replied shortly to Cadwallader's questions. I'm sure.
Then let's move on to the next phase. We familiarise ourselves with the new vessel, make safe and dismantle all Lo Mang's traps, and prepare for our voyage.
Right, so we're done?
For now.
She rose to her feet. I have some business to attend to. Excuse me. Feeling Cadwallader and Jace's eyes on her, knowing they were going to talk about her the minute she left the room, she walked out. Bryce, she conned.
Hey.
He sounded happy to hear from her.
What's up?
Where are you? I want to talk.
That sounds ominous, he joked. She was silent. I'm attending to the bomb Mesban planted.
I'll be there soon. Someone had figured out how to turn on the lights in the viewing dome. Carina halted in that high-vaulted place and looked up. The starscape was dim, outshone by artificial beams. Her mood settled a notch lower.
Over here,
Bryce called out from the edge of the room. He was with a woman, an explosives expert, Carina guessed. He must have directed her to the location of the device and then stuck around to help out. That was so typical of him, always wanting to help, always sticking around. She walked over. The nondescript shapes and lumps she'd seen on her first visit to the chamber turned out to be lamps, seats, tables and loungers. The place was set up for socializing. A party under the stars would be quite something. She passed a low table. Was this what she'd run blindly into after her visor was hit? Was that empty area beyond it where she'd landed and then shot Mesban's man in the stomach when he'd arrived to finish her off? She walked on.
Everything okay?
Bryce asked when she reached him. Not really. The woman he was with looked between them. I'm finished here. The bomb's disarmed. I'll take it and get out of your way. She lifted a device from the deck.
Do you need a hand, Rosa? Asked Bryce.
No thanks, I can manage. Carina stood in silence, looking down, waiting for the woman to leave. After hearing the door close, she went to speak.
Wait,
Bryce said, raising a hand.
Before you say anything, look at this.
He reached out to a sensor on the wall and swiped across it. The lamps overhead blinked out. Immediately the stars shone down, brilliant, filling the space with ethereal light.
Isn't it beautiful? It's different from looking at the night sky, right? The stars are brighter, and they're steady. They don't twinkle. There's something majestic about them, something sublime. Takes my breath away.
He moved behind Carina and wrapped his arms around her, hugging her tightly. Leaning down, he pressed the side of his face against her neck.
We should come back here sometime soon, he murmured. Alone, when the kids have settled in.
He paused and then went on, barely whispering.
We don't have to get married if you don't want to. I realized I was going too fast for you. I'd thought you were thinking the same as me, but I made a mistake. It's fine. I'll wait until you're ready. And if you're never ready, that's okay too.
She breathed in deeply. The feeling of his arms around her, his chest pressed against her back, and the soft bristles of his jaw crushed against her neck was wonderful. She drank in his scent. Gently, she took his arms and pulled them apart. She stepped away and turned around to face him. The starlight lit up his young features. His expression broke her heart. He had guessed what was coming. Touching his cheek, she said, I can't do this. Not ever. I'm not the person I thought I was. It wouldn't work, and I would hurt you. That's what I do. She paused to press the edge of her sleeve against her eyes, stemming her tears. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for dragging you all this way and making you part of my fantasy. You've given up so much for me, risked so much, and I didn't deserve it. I didn't deserve you. She swallowed hard. It's still not too late for you to leave. I can tell Cadwallader to make a detour to the nearest inhabited planet, and I'll give you enough money to pay your passage back to Ithia. It'll take a year or longer to get home, I guess, but you'll make it eventually. Bryce's gaze searched hers, his eyes shadow black under the stars. He leaned forward, took her face in his hands, and kissed her forehead. I don't want to go back to Ithia. I've gotten attached to your little family, Carina Lin. I'm coming with you to Earth. She looked to one side, unable to meet his gaze. Then she walked away, navigating the dark obstacles in the room carefully. When she reached the exit, she halted and turned. Bryce had sat down. Whether he was watching her or not, she couldn't tell. She left him alone in the dark. Chapter 14. Carina was helping to make the final preparations for their epic journey. Her misgivings about her plan to return to Earth had only grown since her meeting with Cadwallader and Jace, yet she had continued to not voice them. She felt as though the expedition was a boulder she'd levered with great effort from the top of a hill, and now it was careering downward at an unstoppable force and pace. She was putting the mage documents into a safe in the storage room, along with other precious items, carefully rolling up the brittle papers and tying thread around the scrolls. She had made copies of all of them and stored the images on databases on the Bathsheba and the Duchess, which had been secured to the colony vessel. Mezban's destroyer, the Peregrine, had also been fixed to the interceptor ship, and her troops were already in stasis. Carina hadn't been present when they'd been made to go into the capsules, but she had heard they'd been reluctant and fearful. Somewhere out in the black was the ship they'd travelled in from Gerial sector, holding its own deep sleep facilities. Apparently, around 3% of the men and women Mezban had brought from her sector hadn't survived stasis. Whether the capsules on the other ship had been faulty or a 3% failure rate was normal, she didn't know. However, it was no wonder the enemy troops had been afraid. In a month or two she would also be entering deep sleep. It was either that or live out years in space. but the report of the reaction of Mezban's soldiers had eroded her convictions about the journey even further. If one of her siblings were to die in transit, she would never forgive herself. She sighed and shook her head as she tied the knot in a thread around the final document. After placing the scroll into the safe, she closed it and set the lock. She wished she knew how to cast a lock that would last thousands of years and required detailed knowledge to open, as the mages on Ostalon had, but the ability was beyond her. Perhaps Darius might be able to do it one day. Though she had had weeks to study the information the papers contained, she still felt she'd only scratched the surface of it. Items like unfamiliar characters and their related castes, and details about the Mage's mountain home on Earth had intrigued her, but she hadn't been able to fully understand them. She stood up and stretched her arms and back. There was plenty more to do before their journey began. As she relaxed and exhaled, Parthenia walked in. Her sister voiced a small "oh" and halted. She turned, about to leave. "Were you looking for something?" asked Carina. "It's fine, it isn't important. Don't be silly. You obviously came here for something. What do you want?" "It doesn't matter." Parthenia was almost out the door. "For stars' sake, this is ridiculous. Come back!" She marched over to her sister. Parthenia halted. "What? What are you going to do? Grab me? Force me to stay and tell you why I'm here?" Carina paused, taken aback by the girl's intense reaction. "No, I just think it's stupid for us to avoid each other." "You aren't avoiding me, I'm avoiding you." "Whatever. Look, I'm sorry for insisting that you left the battle in the deep sleep chamber, but it was for your own good." She reached out to touch her sister's arm, but Parthenia shrugged off the gesture. "I care about you," said Carina, undeterred. She desperately wanted to put things right between them. "I know I have a strange way of showing it sometimes, but I do." "That's right, you do have a strange way of showing it. But don't worry, I'm not going to let you care about me any longer. And I've told the kids they don't have to mind you anymore. From now on, we're going to stick together and run our own lives." She poked Carina in the chest. "You can do whatever the hell you want." She stalked away. Carina's mouth dropped open. Suddenly, the coldness of her siblings toward her over the last few days made sense. After the battle for the Bathsheba, Cadwallader had called a meeting to begin to iron out the details of their forthcoming epic journey. She turned up a little early to the Duchess's mission room and found the Lieutenant Colonel and Jace already there. The ancient mage's record sat on the table. She nodded a greeting. "Right, where do we begin?" "We aren't starting yet," Cadwallader replied. "I took the liberty of inviting some others along. I'd like to create a council of sorts. By my rough calculations, we have about 24 years of travel ahead of us, perhaps longer, through a largely unknown region of space. We need to get our planning right, or perhaps suffer terrible consequences. I want to bring together our best minds and open out the decision-making process." "Who?" Carina's gaze moved to Jace. Had he had some input into Cadwallader's decision? Why hadn't the Lieutenant Colonel asked her about this? "Who have you invited?" As the words left her lips, Atoy walked through the doorway. "Hey, Car," she said, raising a hand in greeting. "Hey, everyone. Thanks for the invite, sir." She threw herself into a seat and reclined into its back, straightening out one of her long legs. "Who else is coming?" "That's what I'd like to know," Carina muttered. Voices could be heard chatting outside the room, drawing nearer. Her heart fluttered in recognition. Bryce and Parthenia entered. Carina's lips drew to a thin line. She could understand Cadwallader's reasoning in including Bryce in the council, but Parthenia? She was a child, a smart, resourceful child, to be sure, but still a kid. She couldn't deny her sister had a valuable contribution to make, but how would she deal with the potentially disastrous fallout from a decision she had helped to make? Could she cope with the guilt and remorse when things didn't go to plan? The sleepless nights? The regret? Parthenia was watching her as she sat down, a mixture of defiance and wariness on her face. "We're all here," Cadwallader said. "Let's begin." "Wait," said Carina. "Yes?" "I'd like to know by whose authority you're opening out the decision-making process. You certainly didn't speak to me about it." Her gaze turned to Jace. "Did he ask you?" He coughed and looked uncomfortable.
"No, but I agree with the principle."
"I don't understand what gives you the right to act unilaterally," Carina said tersely to Cadwallader.
"Look," said Bryce, "if my presence is going to be a problem, I'll leave."
"Me too," Atoy added. "To be honest, I hate sitting around talking, and I trust you guys to think up a good plan." "This isn't about you two," Parthenia said. "It's about me. That's right, isn't it, sis?" Carina doggedly maintained her focus on Cadwallader, but she saw her sister in her peripheral vision, glaring. "You would prefer a more democratic process?" the Lieutenant Colonel asked in a tone dripping acid. "Very well. Jace has stated he agrees we should create a council to manage our journey to Earth, and I'm obviously of the same mind. You disagree. That makes 2 against 1. You're outvoted." He steepled his fingers. "Now we may continue." She slammed the table with an open hand, making everyone jump. She felt like sweeping the documents away, upending the table and telling them all to get out. But she fought her impulse, knowing she'd recently crossed the line with Parthenia for the second time. She said and did nothing else except clench her jaw. After several moments of awkward silence, the Lieutenant Colonel said quietly, "Let's continue." He pulled a piece of paper from the top of the pile and passed it to Atoy, who was sitting nearest to him. "Assuming these are the original galactic coordinates of Earth, as I said, we're looking at a journey of roughly 24 years and 2 months. Fortunately, we'll be spending most of the voyage in deep sleep. Unfortunately, despite the information from the mages, we aren't exactly sure where we're going. Though they recorded their time of departure from Earth, that doesn't seem to relate to current time measurements. They appear to have been using their local frame of temporal reference, not standard time. So, for our purposes, the date they give is useless, which makes it difficult to adjust our calculations to allow for the time that's passed."
"I can tell you the number of mage generations born since leaving Earth, according to our law," said Jace.
Cadwallader's eyebrows lifted. "That may help." Atoy passed the paper to Bryce.
"It's 241,
Jace said. The Lieutenant Colonel's eyes moved up and left as he worked out the arithmetic. "That's well over 7,000 standard years." Atoy whistled.
"That's a heck of a lot of time to be away from home."
Bryce said,
"I heard that human existence in this part of the galaxy is reckoned to date back about 6,500 years. Jace's information fits in with mage history, which states they were the first colonists of deep space." "Interesting," said Cadwallader, "but a subject for another day. If mage lore is accurate, that means we can increase the reliability of our estimation of Earth's current location. Now we need to hash out a rotation for individuals in stasis, among other things. How many should crew the ship while the rest sleep, and for how long?" Bryce offered a suggestion, and then Jace offered another, and after a while the meeting had moved into a detailed discussion of the voyage. Carina didn't speak much.
Cadwallader had been a mastermind of organisation, as always, and the people present mostly agreed with his proposals. She'd seen that he didn't really need their input, that his purpose in inviting the rest had been to make them feel included, that their opinion mattered. Parthenia made some intelligent, thoughtful contributions, and Carina felt proud of her, but whenever she tried to catch her sister's eye, Parthenia purposefully ignored her. It was no surprise the girl was upset with her after their altercation at the battle, but as the discussion wore on, it occurred to Carina that all her siblings had recently shown the same enmity. Ever since the taking of the Bathsheba, they'd been reserved and silent around her. Parthenia's announcement in the storage room that her brothers and sisters were now going it alone without her input made it clear they'd decided to shun her. She watched her sister walk off, the new understanding piercing her deeply. She'd pushed Bryce away, and now she'd lost her brothers and sisters too. She heaved a deep sigh. Parthenia turned a corner and disappeared. Carina set her jaw. She was alone again, but it was probably for the best. Chapter 15. "The rotor's out," said Fern excitedly. "It is?" Oriana jumped up from her seat and ran to him. "Show me." "Wait a minute," her brother replied, scanning the interface screen he was holding. "Let me look up our names." Oriana pouted. "Okay," drawled Fern. "You can look us up." He handed her the screen. His sister clutched it and squeezed in beside him on the armchair, pushing him aside with her butt. Their two heads bent over the interface. Parthenia had chosen a family suite on the Bathsheba for herself and her siblings. The habitation contained 3 bedrooms, and there had been some disagreement over who would sleep where. Oriana and Fern had wanted to continue sharing a room, but Parthenia had pointed out it might be better for the younger children to share with the older siblings of the same sex. The twins had agreed to her suggestion, though somewhat reluctantly, and now Fern shared with Darius and Oriana shared with Nala. The twins seemed to be getting along better as a consequence. They were certainly bickering less. She had taken the 3rd bedroom for herself, where she slept in blissful solitude, with no one's feet poking in her face. Family life since moving out of the Duchess and into the Intersector vessel had generally been more peaceful. As well as having far more room to sleep, they also had the lounge where they were currently sitting. 2 bathrooms they didn't have to share with less than hygienic soldiers, and access to printers that could create just about anything they wanted. Not having Carina around anymore helped too. Life was so much more pleasant without someone controlling your every move. It was true that their eldest sister, half-sister Parthenia reminded herself, had helped them a lot in the early days, but those days were gone now. They were all older and much more experienced. They'd earned the right to be respected and trusted, but Carina hadn't or wouldn't accept it. They'd grown and matured in ways their sister refused to acknowledge. It was a shame they'd been forced to push her out, but it had been inevitable, and there was only one person to blame. "Does that rotor thing say when we'll sleep and when we'll be awake?" asked Darius. He had found a printer that made paper and coloured pencils, and he was busy drawing at the table. His efforts were heavily influenced by the hand-drawn pictures in the ancient Mage documents. Verdant mountains, high castles, stylized trees and flowers, and animal characters. "Yeah, of course," Fern replied. "It's the thing we've been talking about for days, remember?" He added in a tone that sounded as if he wanted to say dummy at the end of his sentence, but his gaze shifted to Parthenia and he stopped there. Darius looked up at Nala, who was sitting opposite him, also drawing, and rolled his eyes. Nala giggled. "I found our names," blurted Oriana. "Let's see what we're doing." Her gaze tracked across the screen. When she registered what she was looking for, her mouth turned down at the corners. We're on the list of the first to remain awake." She looked more closely. "For 8 months!" "Yay!" said Nala. "No, not yay," Oriana said. "I want to go into a deep sleep capsule now and wake up when we get to Earth. Living aboard a starship is so boring." "But we have a big ship to explore," said Nala. "There's lots to do here, not like on the Duchess. Here we can print stuff, go look at the stars, play in the gym hall, explore the agri-center." She swung her legs as she chattered on about the things she and Darius had been doing since transferring over to the Bathsheba. Everyone had been worried about Nala after she'd witnessed the shuttle pilot's death on Ostalon and been trapped in the cabin with his dead body. She'd been withdrawn and quiet, crushed almost, and the feeble light that had begun to glow in her since escaping their dark mage brother, Castiel's control, had been snuffed out. But strangely enough, the cooling of relations with their eldest sister had made her louder and more assertive. Nala continued, "We can go anywhere we want to, now that Carina isn't around too." Her words dried up, and they all sat in unpleasant silence. Darius appeared to be especially affected by the mention of his sister. He put down his pencil and looked as though he was about to cry. He had been the most reluctant to agree to separate from her. He hadn't said much in response to Parthenia's proposal, but his little face had spoken volumes as she explained what they needed to do and why. In a way, it was ironic that he was the one who had resisted the idea. His heightened sensitivity to the emotions of those around him meant he was particularly vulnerable to Carina's regular bouts of anger. Yet perhaps it was to be expected. The two had always been close, ever since their sister had rescued him from the Dirksons. A twinge of guilt hit Parthenia as she recalled the efforts Carina had gone to in protecting and helping them, but she pushed it away. Maybe the time would come when they would be one happy family again, but it was a long way distant. A big shift in attitude and behavior was required, and not on the part of the children of Stefan Scherer. "Can I see the rota?" Parthenia asked, eager to move the subject on from their sister. She held out a hand to Oriana, who passed the interface over. The information displayed reflected almost exactly what had been decided at the council meeting. Around 3/4 of the mercenaries were to go into deep sleep next week, but the rest would remain awake and on duty. The feeling had been that the Bathsheba was still at a small risk of attack and would remain so for several months, until she'd reached the vast galactic desert that lay before the Gerial sector. Those who stayed awake during those months would be on hand to defend the ship, and, if necessary, the mercs in stasis could be brought out of it. After the initial 8 months of their journey were up, most of the remaining passengers would also enter the capsules. The small crew required to maintain the ship would be drawn from the pool of sleepers on a rotating basis, so that no one had to live longer than 3 years on the ship in total. At some point, when the Bathsheba scanners detected a planet suitable for marooning Lomang, Mezban and their troops, they would make a detour, but that was to be their only diversion in their journey to Earth. During the part of the discussion when decisions were thrashed out about who would go into stasis, when and for how long, Parthenia had argued that, firstly, the children would always be together, in stasis or out of it. The idea that 1 or 2 of them could grow older while the others slept was disturbing. Secondly, she'd insisted that the mages would be among those who would delay going into deep sleep until the ship was safe. Neither Carina nor Cadwallader had been able to deny that their powers were invaluable in a battle. Knowing Oriana and Fern might object to a delay before entering stasis, she hadn't said anything to them about what had been agreed upon, but they seemed to have accepted the fact fairly easily. They were already scrolling through sims the Bathsheba had available for the entertainment of passengers taking a break from stasis. Parthenia checked the rota again. Bryce had elected to remain awake for the first 8 months too. Yet she'd noticed that he and Carina didn't seem to spend any time together anymore. Carina had taken a single cabin, and she guessed Bryce had done the same. Something must have happened between the two of them, and they'd split up. The guilty twinge hit again. She hadn't considered the impact that forcing her sister out of the family group would have on the man she'd come to think of as a brother. Rejecting Bryce as well hadn't been her intention. Did he think their decision extended to him? If he and Carina were no longer together, he might be uncertain about his relationship with them. Putting down the interface, she decided to go and pay him a visit. She would let him know he was welcome to visit them any time, that they still liked him and wanted him in their lives. As she stepped out of their suite into the corridor, however, she realized she didn't know where on the vast ship he was living. She connected to the ship's computer and asked for the location of his cabin. The answer took several seconds to arrive, which she took to mean the Black Dog's techs were still struggling with integrating the Duchess's comm system with the Bathsheba's. Everyone was waiting for the person-to-person comm to come online. Bryce had picked a place near the Starscape dome. She was still a little unfamiliar with the intersector ship's layout, but she knew the location of the dome. She set off, but she hadn't gone far before she spotted one of the mercenaries walking toward her with a determined gait. She avoided the man's gaze and moved to the side of the corridor to give him a wide berth, but he veered in the same direction. She grew uneasy and annoyed. Was he going to try something, like that other soldier, Chandu? She had been dismayed to hear the horrible man decided to remain with the Black Dogs after Carina had executed Sable Dirksen. He'd left her alone after she had punched him, but she still didn't like the idea of sharing a ship with him. Did this other merc have the same intentions? The corridor was empty except for the two of them. She had no personal comm, and no one might hear her shout for help. Should she run back to her suite? She didn't want to look like a silly girl overreacting to the situation.
"Excuse me,"
said the merc as he arrived within talking distance.
"It's Parthenia, right?"
"Yes, but I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry."
"This won't take a minute."
Inwardly cringing, she halted. The soldier looked very young for his profession. Parthenia guessed he might have joined up about the same age as Carina. He held out his hand.
"I wanted to say thanks for saving my life."
She weakly shook his hand, realizing he had to be one of the mercs she'd healed at the battle in the deep sleep chamber. "You're welcome," she said, excessively politely.
"You don't remember me, do you?"
He was smiling.
"My name's Scanlon, by the way. Camille Scanlon."
The name rang a bell, but she still couldn't place him. "I'm sorry, but—"
"I guess I must have looked a lot different at the time. The doc rejuvenated my burned skin."
An image of a soldier opening his visor, revealing a seared face covered in blood and whispering his gratitude for her efforts to save him, popped into Parthenia's mind. "Stars!" she exclaimed. "I remember you now." She recalled another mercenary had scooped him up and carried him away. She'd been so sure he'd been beyond saving. "I thought you'd died."
"Not yet," said Scanlon with a wink. "But I might have if it hadn't been for you. You kept me alive until someone could get me to the sick bay. Even then, from what the medics said, it was touch and go. But I'm back to normal now, so I thought I'd find you and show my gratitude."
"You don't have to do that. I was only doing what I could to help, the same as you." Parthenia looked into the young man's kind eyes, and her stomach did a small flip. To her shame, she felt her face grow hot. Scanlan said,
"No, what you do is special. I'm just a grunt. Still, I thought maybe you wouldn't mind."
Now it appeared to be his turn to grow embarrassed. His gaze turned downward, and his cheeks reddened. He cleared his throat.
"Would you like to have dinner with me? It would just be something from the printers, but I know how to." He coughed. "I mean, it's not much, but—"
She didn't answer immediately, too surprised to reply.
"It's okay,"
said Scanlan, stepping back.
"This was a really dumb idea. It's just, I remember seeing your face when I thought I was a goner, and you were so—"
He sighed.
"I can't explain it, but you looked— it meant a lot to me, and—"
"I'd like that," Parthenia interrupted. "Dinner," she added awkwardly.
"You're saying yes?"
Relief and happiness broke over his features. "Yes," she laughed. "I'm saying yes." Chapter 16. Carina had decided to get to know the Bathsheba intimately while she waited the 8 months before she entered deep sleep. The vessel was vast, and if they were to come under attack, a detailed knowledge of her layout could be vital. She had begun her tour at the highest part of the ship, and then worked her way down to the deep sleep chamber, where the battle against Mezban's troops had been fought. It was one of 2 chambers serving the same purpose, the other lying on the same level but on the opposite side of the vessel. She stood in the centre of the room. The floor was as smooth and fresh as if it had been manufactured yesterday. All signs of the firefight had gone. No one seemed to understand how the Bathsheba's interior surfaces self-repaired. She had encountered plenty of self-cleaning starships, usually facilitated by nanobots, and most ships self-repaired to an extent, but she'd never known one that fixed itself on a microscopic level. Her gaze roved the rows of egg-like structures that protruded from the walls. The stasis capsules. Many were now occupied by naked figures in fetal positions, only just visible through the tinted shells. Purely for convenience's sake, Mezban's troops and the rest of the prisoners had been ensconced in the lower levels. The upper lines of capsules were empty. The sight brought back a childhood memory. She recalled one of the many insects she had watched and studied when she was young, before Nai died. A flying creature that lived in groups of hundreds and produced a deliciously sweet, sticky liquid. Her grandmother had said they were called bees. Folklore warned that the golden, viscous liquid was poisonous, but she had suspected it was a white lie intended to discourage children from trying to take it. The bees built tiny chambers in layers to hold their precious fluid. Early in the year, many of the cavities stood empty, but they would fill them all by the time the cool season arrived. The small creatures would sting if they felt threatened. She had enthralled the bees to calm them, and then taken and eaten their liquid without coming to any harm. The vacant and occupied deep sleep capsules reminded her of the bees' storage cells. Only the contents of the filled capsules aboard the Bathsheba were not nearly so appetizing, though she hoped that Lomang and Mezban would prove as harmless as the bees. They had both sent her savage looks when it came their turn to go into stasis. Lomang's polite subservience had disappeared, and Mezban had made threats of what she would do to Carina once she was free. Papu had put up no resistance at all. Lomang's influence over his brother had always been clear, but in Mezban's presence he became positively submissive. Calverley had put up the biggest physical resistance, shouting and fighting with surprising vigour for a man his age. Perhaps his excessive years made him reluctant to expose himself to the process. He hadn't said so, but he might have thought he was at a greater risk of never waking up. Perhaps he was right. Now he, like the others, floated in nutrient, his mind stilled and his bodily functions all but stopped. What would it be like to experience deep sleep? She sighed and strode out of the chamber. Her next stop was the second airlock on this level and the Bathsheba's largest portal. It was where Mezban's soldiers had boarded. Cadwallader had decided to leave the Peregrine attached for the duration of the voyage, reasoning that the ship would hinder another enemy accessing the main airlock. She didn't think the Peregrine presented much of an obstacle to a determined attacker, and she would have preferred to secure the ship somewhere less easily accessible, in the unlikely event Mezban escaped confinement. But Cadwallader had had the final say. She was interested in the main airlock for another reason. It might have served as the entrance for the original passengers, the colonists on their way to a new planet. She wondered who they'd been, where they'd come from, and where they'd been heading. How old was the ship? It was impossible to tell. The vessel retained no outer signs of wear and tear, and the language its systems used was unrecognizable, so it was impossible to read the ship's log. The Black Dog's techs had suffered through days of difficulty trying to interact with the vessel's main computer. In the end, she had resorted to enthralling Lo Mang and forcing him to help. He clearly did understand the strange language, or he would not have been able to captain the ship. She made him translate some long texts in the Bathsheba's database into universal speech, thus teaching the computer how to understand the texts rather than vice versa. Later on, prior to putting the man into stasis, she had asked him where he'd acquired the Bathsheba, but he had refused to answer. At the time, it had seemed too much bother to enthrall the man again, but now she wished she had. The procurement of such ships was a mystery. Her earcom suddenly sparked into life, making her jump. "Lin, where are you?" Cadwallader's customary gruff tone quickly dragged her out of her musings. She answered his question, adding, "So the tech's got the personal comm system working?" "Yes, finally. What are you doing down there?" "Just looking around. I've been—" "Come up to the Twilight Dome. We're having a celebration." The Twilight Dome was the name someone had given the Bathsheba's viewing chamber, and the name had stuck. She hadn't been there since she'd told Bryce she wanted to split up, and the thought of returning to the place, especially for a celebration, gave her a sickening feeling in the pit of her stomach. She decided not to go. If Cadwallader had sanctioned a party, there would be alcohol, and perhaps other substances involved, and after a while she wouldn't be missed. If he queried her tomorrow, she could say she'd attended but only stayed a short while. Her earcom sprang to life again. "That's an order," the Lieutenant Colonel said. "Hey, you're not my CO. No one's my CO. I'm not a soldier anymore." "Come on, Carina. Who are you trying to kid? You know you'll always be a merc at heart." She blinked. Had she detected a slight slurring in the Lieutenant Colonel's speech? "Sir, are you drunk?" "You see, you can't help calling me sir, can you? Come up here. You're missing all the fun." In the years she'd known Cadwallader, she'd only seen him let his guard down a handful of times, and even then he'd only been somewhat less formal than usual. Intrigue overcame her reluctance to attend a social gathering, and she headed for the nearest elevator. The Twilight Dome was filled with people. The artificial lights had been turned down to a mere glow, presumably to avoid losing the impact of the starscape above, and the dimly lit figures were occupying the lounge chairs and sofas, standing around in groups or milling about. From the numbers present, she guessed most of the Black Dogs had to be here. Party music mixed with the chatter. A tall figure was walking toward her. It took her a moment to recognize Cadwallader, and not only due to the low light. He was wearing a dark-coloured sweater and slacks. It was the first time she'd ever seen him out of uniform. "Glad you could make it, Lin. I couldn't disobey a direct order, could I?" She smiled wryly. "Exactly. What do you want to drink?" "I don't know. Something light. I probably won't stay long." "Let's see what they have." He led her through the throng of bantering mercs to the edge of the room where a small crowd had gathered around a bar. Cadwallader gave a loud cough, and the crowd parted to let him through. He winked at her, saying, "Commander's privilege." She was surprised by the array of drinks displayed at the back of the bar. The basic printed labels indicated they'd been created on the ship. "What'll you have?" asked the bartender, who turned out to be Jackson. "I don't know what half those drinks are. I don't want anything too strong." "I know just the thing." Jackson took down a bottle and poured a measure of the liquid into a jug. The lieutenant colonel leaned on the bar. "I figured you hadn't heard about the party when I noticed you weren't here. Even without the person-to-person comm, the news travelled fast. I don't think I've spoken to anyone today. I've been busy getting to know the ship." "Smart idea." Jackson had added 2 more drinks and ice to the jug. He screwed on the lid and shook it with his prosthetic arm so fast the jug became a blur. "I knew a robot arm would come in handy one day," he quipped as he unscrewed the lid and poured the mixture into a glass. After pushing the glass toward her, he turned to serve someone else. She sipped the cold cocktail. It was refreshing and light and not overly alcoholic. "I have a couple of seats over there." The lieutenant colonel indicated the far side of the room with a nod. "Care to join me?" The reason he'd asked her to come to the celebration became apparent. He wanted to talk tactics. That was fine with her, though she felt a little duped. She could have completed her study of the ship, and they could have talked tomorrow. Cadwallader's seats were next to the wall at a point where the transparent dome extended all the way down to the deck. The seats faced each other across a small, low table. To her right, the black stretched out, seemingly to infinity. As she sat down, dizziness momentarily overcame her, and she clutched the chair arm, her drink slopping dangerously. The lieutenant colonel reached over and took her other arm to steady her. "It's quite the spectacle, isn't it?" he asked, as she regained her balance. "Sure is." She took another sip of her drink and then set it down. Cadwallader refilled his glass from a half-empty pitcher. He looked out into the emptiness of space. "When I'm aboard a starship, I sometimes forget this is what I'm travelling through." The stars looked utterly motionless, though she guessed the Bathsheba had already built up considerable speed. The distances involved were too great for their movement to show. "I know what you mean." The lieutenant colonel continued to stare into the starscape, appearing lost in thought. "What's the celebration about? Is it because we took the ship?" "Huh?" said Cadwallader, returning to the present. "No. Tomorrow's the day most of the mercs go into stasis. I thought it wouldn't hurt to allow them to let their hair down a little, ease their jitters." "Oh, I get it. Makes sense. I confess I'm nervous about it myself." "It's natural. From what I understand, the odds are a tiny minority won't wake up. Still, there are worse ways to die." His gaze returned to the void. He seemed uncharacteristically pensive. She wondered when they were going to talk tactics. Suddenly he asked, "You knew Captain Speedle quite well, didn't you?" She was taken aback. It hadn't occurred to her he might want to go over old times. Cadwallader was probably the least sentimental person she knew. "I wouldn't say that. More the other way around. He rarely talked about himself, but he was a great mentor. He saved my life. If I'd stayed where I was when he found me, I would probably be dead by now. Or enslaved, she added mentally. Stefan Scherer had told her once he guessed Ma had borne a child before he raped her and Parthenia was conceived. It would have been just like him to seek out her mother's firstborn one day, eager to add her to his brood of mages. Cadwallader said, "I'll always remember the dirty, scrawny ragamuffin John brought back to the ship. You looked like you hadn't seen soap or a hairbrush in several years, and you smelt as bad as you looked. It took all his powers of persuasion to convince Tarsalan to take you on. He threatened to resign if she refused." Her throat tightened. "Really? I didn't know that." "Well, you proved him right. You turned out to be a good soldier, a credit to the band." "Thanks," she said quietly. "I owe it to Captain Speedle. I wouldn't be who I am without him." A lump was rising in her throat. He would talk to me when no one else was around sometimes, one-to-one, giving me advice and encouragement. He was like a father. She'd been speaking softly, directing her attention to the black, unsure even if the lieutenant colonel could hear her. When she looked at him, however, she was shocked to see his eyes wet and glimmering. He was a good person. If she had ever doubted her suspicion that Speedle and Cadwallader had been a lot more to each other than fellow officers, those doubts were now cast aside. "You must miss him." He pursed his lips and looked down. She waited, leaving him to his emotions. She missed John Speedle too. The party was growing rowdier, which was only to be expected among the black dogs. With luck, Atoy was somewhere around and not too drunk to put a stop to things before they got out of hand. It would be a shame if Cadwallader was compelled to put his grief aside to deal with the unruly men and women. The lieutenant colonel cleared his throat. "I haven't seen you with that young man recently. Have you two fallen out?" "Bryce? No, we haven't fallen out exactly," she replied uneasily, confused by the sudden movement of the conversation toward her love life. Was this why he'd asked her to come here? He gazed at her steadily, waiting for more. "I thought it was better to call things off between us." "Why was that?" Appearing to notice her discomfort, he added, "If you don't mind my asking." "Yes, I do mind. I just thought we would be better off apart." She closed her lips firmly, unprepared to say any more. She didn't dislike Cadwallader, but he wasn't Captain Speedle. She wasn't about to unburden herself to him about her self-doubt and dread of hurting the people she loved. He tilted his head, his eyes searching her face. When she maintained her silence, he said, "The black is a lonely place, Carina. If you find someone who's right for you and who believes in you, you should hold on to them. The opportunity may never come along again." "Thanks for the advice. I'll bear it in mind." The corner of his lip lifted in a sad smile. It was time for a change of subject. "I was wondering what we might come up against during the voyage. I don't know a lot about the Gerial sector." "I don't know much more than you. Perhaps we made a mistake in putting Lomang and Mesbang into stasis so early. They might have been able to tell us what we can expect." "Honestly, I'm reluctant to continue enthralling Lomang. If you do it too much, it can permanently damage the person's mind. But I guess I could have tried it with Mesban." She winced at the thought of using the cast on the woman. Her fury afterward would be stupendous. "It's too late now anyway. Whatever happens, we'll have to face it the best we can. I also haven't discounted the possibility of the Dirksons tracking us down." "You think they would come all this way just to avenge Sable's death?" "Maybe. It depends how much she meant to them." "Should I ask Darius to cloak the ship?" She hadn't asked her brother to perform his special cast for a long time, imagining they must have left the evil clan behind weeks ago.
Would he be able to cloak a ship this size?
I'm not sure, and it would be impossible to tell if Darius had managed to do it, as well as draining for the little boy to regularly make such powerful casts.
I think the odds of a Dirksen attack are remote. We'll have to take our chances.
I guess so. She hoped that if an attack were to come, it would happen in the next 8 months, before she went into deep sleep. Chapter 17. After the crowdy, noisy conditions on the Duchess, life aboard the Bathsheba had been an escape into silence and solitude, even before the majority of the black dogs went into stasis. Once that part of the plan had been enacted, it became possible to pass entire days without encountering or hearing a single soul, which was exactly how Carina liked it. Not that she didn't miss her siblings or Bryce, but her experiences had taught her that, in one way or another, she was a danger to them. The damage she had done to their lives was irrevocable. Bryce had left his family and was journeying into a risky and unknown future, and her siblings believed they were some kind of mage soldiers who had an obligation to fight in every battle they encountered. Little Darius had nearly died too, and it was all because of her. If she couldn't persuade them away from the path she had set them on, the least she could do now was to keep her distance and avoid causing more damage. As the days wore on and the Bathsheba crossed the galactic wilderness where star systems were few and habitable planets were fewer, her days developed a set routine. She would wake early during the active shift and check in with Cadwallader for the latest updates. Invariably, there was little to report. Next, she would work out, shower, and eat. Then she would tour the ship, checking the airlocks and the deep sleep chamber that held Mesban and her troops. Though the Black Dog's techs had done a great job of familiarizing themselves with the system, she still believed it might be possible for a Gerial Sector native to override the ship's computer without triggering an alarm. After eating lunch alone at one of the many secluded food printing stations, she would spend her afternoon sifting through information in the vessel's database. She used the imperfect translation system the ship had developed with Lo Mang's help, and as time progressed and she grew more bored, she began to teach herself the new language. Her understanding increased accordingly. One day, as she was digging deeper and deeper into the oldest archives, she came across a document entitled Origins. Scanning the text, she saw many words the computer couldn't translate, but her new knowledge enabled her to guess the meanings of some of them. Her eyebrows rose as she read. Assuming the measurement of time in the Gerial sector roughly corresponded with standard time, the vessel dated back 471 years. It hardly seemed possible. Perhaps the people who built the ship measured time differently from the system she knew. The next part of the text related to why the Bathsheba had been built. The first appearance of, the word was untranslated, is not recorded, but every century their numbers increased. They took the young worlds first, where life had barely begun. Our ancestors observed their practice but did nothing, imagining, untranslated. Then they came to our planets. A word Carina guessed might mean illness or perhaps disease. We tried to reason with them, telling them their presence was a danger to us, but they did not listen. They told us their world was old and dying, and they had nowhere else to go. This was not true. They had not even filled the first planets they settled on. It was only their greed that drove them on. More, untranslated, continued to arrive. We tried to repel them, but our efforts were unsuccessful. Their weapons pierced and burned us. Before that time we did not practice warfare. We had no technology or... Carina figured the word here meant strategy, to protect ourselves or fight back. As the years passed and we lost more and more battles and more land to the invaders, we learned new methods and invented weapons of our own. We also developed the untranslated. We took back some of our land, but for generations the wars have continued. Warfare is now all our children know and all they can expect. But some of us do not wish to fight. We cling to the ways of our forebears. We seek a new, something like road. We, the untranslated, built this space vessel untranslated. Clearly it was Lo Mang, or maybe an earlier owner who had named it Bathsheba, to escape the invaders and the endless conflict. We will find a new world, a young planet, far from conflict and unnecessary death. We will settle there, practice the ways of the past, and live in peace. And live in peace. She sat back from the screen, amazed and intrigued. Live in peace. The people who had built the colony starship sounded like mages, and the vessel's surfaces self-repaired, unlike any other ship she'd known. Was that ability due to a long-forgotten caste? Was it possible the first mages who had left Earth had settled in the Gerial sector? Had they remained there for thousands of years, living peaceful lives, until usurpers arrived and drove them from their homes? Maybe she'd been wrong about Ostalon being one of the first, if not the first, planet her ancestors had settled. If mages had manufactured weapons and fought back against the invaders, that was an aspect of her culture that was new to her. The more she thought about it, and, except for the self-repairing feature, she hadn't encountered anything else about the Bathsheba that reminded her of her clan. What seemed more likely was that the Bathsheba's builders and original passengers were from a different, non-violent group of people. Perhaps they had also left Earth during the early days of galactic colonization, and then their settled worlds had been invaded by a later wave of more aggressive humans. A horrible thought struck. Had the newcomers deliberately passed on an infection? It would be an effective way to commit genocide, destroying the members of another civilization in order to take over their living space. At least it appeared that all the events described in the database document had happened long ago. She didn't relish the idea of journeying through a war zone. Nevertheless, the information could be important. She calmed Cadwallader. "Are you busy?"
"I have only 25 bored soldiers to command aboard a ship in the middle of nowhere. What do you imagine I would be busy doing?"
A simple no would also work. "I found something interesting. I'm sending it to you, and I'm coming up for a chat." She hadn't seen the lieutenant colonel in several weeks. His uniform was as crisp and neat as always, though the merc she'd encountered occasionally around the ship were beginning to look sloppy and unkempt. She guessed it was hard to maintain high standards when the soldiers had little to do. No dangers threatened them as far as they knew, and the ship looked after herself. Morale was probably slipping too, inevitable when you had a group of young, active men and women and nothing much for them to expend their energy on. It was just as well they would all be entering stasis in a few weeks. Cadwallader looked up from his interface screen.
"I'm supposed to understand this?"
She had forgotten she'd figured out the meaning of many of the words the computer hadn't translated. She gave him a rundown on what the text meant.
"That is interesting,"
he said, looking thoughtfully at the screen.
But this all happened ages ago, right?
I think so, but I still don't have a clear understanding of their chronometry.
So it might still be relevant to us.
I guess it's possible these wars are going on even now. She paused as another concern popped into her mind. There's something else. The Bathsheba's a massive ship. Not the kind of vessel that would be forgotten easily, even if she was built a long time ago. What if the original people who built her want her back? What if she's spotted and recognized?
In all the vastness of an entire galactic sector? That's very unlikely. On the other hand,
he tapped his lips.
I don't like the sound of the aggressive race. They could have spread across the entire sector by now. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to increase the numbers out of stasis at any time. The troops won't thank me. It's going to mean more years awake for everyone. But it's better than being slaughtered while in deep sleep.
I wonder if Lo, Mang, Mezban and the rest are descended from the invaders. Cadwallader shrugged.
There's no point in speculating. Thanks for bringing this to my attention, Lin. I'll think on it.
She left. It was getting near dinner time. Usually in the evenings, after eating she would retire to her cabin in an otherwise unoccupied residential section in a remote corner of the ship. There she would spend the remaining time before sleep meditating and mentally rehearsing the strokes, characters, the seasons, the map, and everything else Nai had taught her. Certain things, like the map, had no real significance any longer, yet she found comfort and peace of mind in repeating the habits of her childhood. Somewhat lost in reverie as she thought about the ancient war and the Bathsheba's builders, she almost didn't notice a movement ahead of her, where the corridor opened out to make room for an elevator tube. When she looked more closely at the spot, it was empty. She halted, her heart beginning to race. Sweat prickled her skin. What had she seen? Had enemies managed to board the ship? Her hand moved to her side instinctively, but she wasn't carrying a weapon. As non-military personnel she wasn't required to, and she'd gotten out of the habit. Her elixir flask remained by her side, however. Removing it from its holder, she calmed Cadwallader.
"What?"
came his usual terse reply. "I think we may have— Oh, shit!" Darius had stepped out from around the bend in the corridor. "False alarm!" She sank to her knees as the little boy walked slowly closer, dragging his feet and looking down. "Sweetheart, what is it? What's wrong?" When he reached her, Darius lifted his head to meet her gaze. "I cast to find you, but I wasn't sure if it was okay to come and see you. The others don't know. You won't tell them, right?" His big brown eyes were shiny. "Of course I won't." She pulled her brother into a hug and sat down on the floor with him on her lap, happiness and anguish coursing through her. He rested his head on her shoulder. "I missed you." "I've missed you too, so much. I've missed all of you." "If you miss me, why don't you come and see me? Is it because Parthenia doesn't want you to?" She heaved a deep sigh. "It isn't Parthenia's fault. It's just better this way. You know how you feel what I feel. I always seem to be angry or upset when I'm around you guys. I don't want to hurt you anymore." "It hurts more when you're not around." An aching sob rose in her chest. She didn't want to cause him more pain. The stars knew. She loved him deeply, the same as she loved all her brothers and sisters. She was trapped. No matter what she did, she was the bane of her siblings' lives. Chapter 18. Darius's unhappiness sparked a change of heart in Carina. The following morning, she sat brooding in her cabin, wondering if she'd given up on her relationship with her family too soon. Now they were on their journey to Earth, Perhaps she could avoid exposing them to danger, hurting them, and generally ruining everything. She decided to give things one last try. But any potential reconciliation faced one major obstacle: Parthenia. Her oldest sister was the one who had persuaded the others to shut her out. She was sure of it, and not without justification. She had crossed the line with Parthenia on more than one occasion, and though it had always been for the girl's safety and protection, she clearly didn't see it that way. The girl had changed a lot since Carina had first gotten to know her. She had never been the meek, obliging character she portrayed to the world. That had been made evident the moment she'd helped to defeat the Shura guards on the Nightfall. But as time had passed, she'd grown even stronger and more assertive, and if Carina had harboured any doubt about the girl's inner steel, it had been put to bed when she'd punched their brother Castiel and escaped from Langley Dirkson's clutches without any help from anyone. She had a huge amount of respect for Parthenia, yet somehow she seemed to have given her the opposite impression. If she could convince her of that, try to explain things from her own perspective, maybe they could find a way forward. Before she'd moved her things to a cabin far distant from the suite her siblings occupied, in order to avoid the mutual embarrassment of bumping into them by accident, Carina had borrowed something personal from each of them. These were not valuable items or anything that would be missed. A pencil that Darius had used, one of Oriana's hairpins, and so on. As well as serving as a small connection to the people she loved, she had also taken the things as a way of finding them in an emergency. Darius seemed to have done the same for her, and maybe for the other children too. Her need at the moment didn't exactly constitute an emergency, but it was important enough to warrant the mild invasion of privacy. She reached under her bed and pulled out a box, lifting it onto her lap. She opened the lid. Among the rest of her family's personal artifacts inside lay several strands of hair she'd taken from Parthenia's comb. She took them out and wrapped them around her hand. After closing her eyes, she cast Locate. The Bathsheba, grey and eerie, swam into focus in her mind's eye. The vast ship, her serried levels, and her pulsing engines were faintly illuminated lines in the dark void. Slightly brighter than the vessel's infrastructure were the individuals aboard her. Tiny figures moved along the passageways, rose up or sank down in the elevators, or congregated in the dining rooms, the twilight dome, and the gym. Others lay in their beds, sleeping before rising for the quiet shift, or floated in minute oval bubbles in the deep sleep chamber. A single bright spark shone out. Parthenia was leaving the gym, and she seemed to be alone. Perfect. Carina would be able to speak with her in private, out of the hearing of their siblings. They could thrash out their problems and come to a better understanding. She set off to see her sister. Parthenia was physically drained but happy after her session training in unarmed combat. Learning the moves wasn't difficult, but she grew tired quickly when practicing them. The instructor, Atoy, had advised her to work out every day, focusing on her upper body strength. She intended to follow the advice. She had grown tired of trying to understand the Sims. The characters spoke in a foreign language that the computer translated really badly, and she'd gotten bored of spending most of her time with her brothers and sisters. They were kids and only interested in kid stuff. A daily workout would give her something to do. Not that she'd been spending all her time with her siblings, she reminded herself, a flush stealing over her face. After that first dinner with Camille, when they'd talked for hours about where they'd come from, their lives before they'd ended up aboard the Bathsheba, and so many other things, most of which she'd forgotten, they'd met several more times. Camille was 18, she had discovered, and he came from a planet deep within Dirksen territory. His country was cool and wet, he'd told her, and in the winter snow and ice lay on the ground 4 meters deep. The people wore long flat blades on their feet to help them get around, and in the summer everyone had to wear all-body suits to protect them from biting insects. He'd wanted to try to find a place where the politicians weren't all corrupt and controlled by the Dirksen clan, but he hadn't had enough money to even get off planet. So he'd joined the military. Then he'd discovered the military was also in the pockets of the Dirksens. So as soon as he'd had the chance, when his unit had set down on Martha's Rest, he'd absconded. That had been when he'd joined the Black Dogs, while the band was preparing for the raid on Ostalon. After hearing his story, Parthenia thought Camille had fit an awful lot into his 18 years. But then, since her father had made the move to involve his family in the Shura war with its rival clan, her life had been busy too. At their 4th meeting, they'd kissed. She felt her face grow even hotter with the memory.
"Parthenia!"
a voice called from behind her. She halted and, flustered, surreptitiously fanned her neck in an attempt to return her skin to its usual colour.
"Hey, Parthenia,"
the person behind her said.
"I was hoping I'd find you here."
Knowing she was still embarrassingly red-faced, she turned around.
"How did the combat session go?"
Camille asked. "Great. Hard work, but really great."
"You look like you need a refreshing drink. Want to get one together?"
"I'd love to." They walked on.
"Who is coaching you?"
When Parthenia told him, he grimaced and said,
"She trained me too. She's a hard ass, but I learned a lot."
"I didn't think she pushed us too hard. I mean, if it doesn't hurt, you're not improving, right?" Camille laughed.
"You got that from her, didn't you?"
She replied slightly defensively. "What if I did?" Raising his hands, Camille said,
"I don't mean anything. It's just I remember her saying that."
He spread his legs, stood on his tiptoes, put one hand on his hip, moved his shoulders back, waggled a finger at her and said,
"If it don't hurt, you're not improving."
She chuckled.
"So, what did you learn?"
"We focused mostly on defense today."
"Want to show me some moves?"
"Sure," she said, happy to show off what she'd learned. "Why don't you try to grab me from behind?"
"Walk a little way ahead."
She walked a few paces farther, listening for Camille's approach. She'd expected him to run at her, but she couldn't hear him, so she guessed he was going to try to surprise her. Suddenly, his arm dropped over her face. He was going for a chokehold. Before he had a chance to get a good grip, she pushed her chin toward her chest, forcing his arm away from her neck. He wasn't pressing hard. She went to elbow him in the stomach, not too strongly, but before she had time to make contact, she heard the crack of a blow on flesh. Camille's hold on her was instantly released. A body hit the floor. Parthenia spun around. Camille was sprawled out, and Carina was standing over him, drawing her elbow back, preparing to punch him again. Parthenia screamed and leapt at her sister. "What the hell are you doing? Leave him alone!" She grabbed Carina's arm. "He was trying to hurt you," Carina shouted, struggling with her. "I'm going to make him regret it." Camille was stirring. He sat up and shook his head. Then he noticed the sisters fighting. A look of alarm on his face, he scooted away from them on his butt. "He's my friend!" Parthenia exclaimed as she wrestled with her sister. "I was showing him what I learned at combat training today, you idiot!"
"Huh?"
Carina seemed to finally understand as she stopped trying to break free.
I think you misunderstood,
said Camille, standing up and rubbing a spot above his ear. He's my friend, Parthenia repeated, tears of anger and shame spilling from her eyes. She pushed Carina away from her. Why do you always have to interfere? Why? Why can't you leave me alone? I saw him attack you. I just thought I wanted to protect you. When are you going to understand I don't need you?
Parthenia,
Camille said gently.
I'm sure it was an honest mistake. Anyone seeing what I did wouldn't have known.
It wasn't you, it was her. She's always butting in, trying to control everything I do, always overreacting. I'm sick of it.
Okay, I think I'd better give you two some space. No hard feelings,
Camille added to Carina before leaving. Parthenia faced her sister, her hands clenched at her sides. Carina said, For the last time, leave me alone. I don't want to have anything to do with you ever again. Stay out of my life. Her sister went to speak, but she changed her mind. She nodded and then walked away. Parthenia drew in a shuddering breath and wiped her eyes. Maybe this time Carina would finally get the message. Chapter 19. The time had finally come. Carina faced the open, empty, deep sleep capsule. She was alone on an upper tier of the chamber, except for one of the Black Dog's medics who sat at the entrance, interface in hand, checking the list of who was to enter stasis today. Never in her life had she undergone anything resembling deep sleep. She hadn't even had an operation or any other medical procedure. Nine-Eye had warned her to avoid splicers at all costs, fearful that they might investigate her genome and discover something odd and unique to mages. From that moment onward, she would be on the slippery slope to captivity and enslavement, or torture, if she refused to perform. The fact that one of Mezban's soldiers had already died didn't help her feelings of trepidation. The man had been entirely normal and healthy, yet the capsule had signalled he was passing away. Though the medics got him out and treated him in record time, nothing had worked. He had never woken up, never knew he was dying. Perhaps that was for the best. She looked around the chamber. The capsules in the lower tiers were already filled with mercs, many of whom had entered stasis soon after the voyage began. Cadwallader had entered his too, leaving Atoy in charge, and so had Carina's brothers and sisters. She remembered the farewells of her siblings with painful clarity. The previous months of rarely even seeing her brothers and sisters, let alone interacting with them, had been difficult to endure. She had thought her years of living alone on the streets as a child had accustomed her to a solitary life, and that was probably true. But when it came to her siblings, she had found being apart from them torturous. She missed them all deeply, and every night she'd worried about their welfare, rarely getting more than a few hours' sleep. Yet after the embarrassing incident with Parthenia, she had ceased questioning the wisdom of her self-imposed separation. There was no doubt in her mind that for her brothers and sisters she was bad news. Yet when she'd encountered them all again outside the deep sleep chamber, the difficulties of the past 8 months had faded to nothing. Faced with the prospect of never seeing each other again, they had clung to each other as tightly as if the hull had been breached and depressurization was trying to rip them apart. Except for Parthenia. She had stood away from her siblings as they'd each hugged goodbye. Now they were all nestled in stasis chambers like baby birds in translucent eggs. She hoped to the stars she would see them all again. Perhaps she could still find a better way forward with them once they woke up, 5 years from now. Their capsules had been programmed to wake them up 5 years hence. After that, she and her family would live out several months aboard the ship before entering deep sleep again. At the meeting where the rota had been decided, Cadwallader had suggested dividing the mages into 2 groups to spread out the benefit of their powers to the ship's defence. But Carina and Parthenia had argued as one that the family should never be split up. She gazed at the smooth pale grey interior of the place where she would spend the next 5 years. Tiny holes peppered the inner surface, from which liquid nutrient would spray after the capsule sealed. Before that happened, she should already be unconscious. From what she'd heard, the experience was supposed to be like falling asleep and waking up again, though complete recovery took about a week. She thumped the heel of her hand against her forehead. That was enough speculation. It was time to get in.
Carina!
Bryce! His voice had come from below. She turned and peered over the railing. He was walking across the deck of the chamber.
Wait there! I'm coming up!
The realization hit her like an explosive going off. This was why she had delayed entering stasis. As his footsteps echoed on the metal treads, a surge of relief washed over her. She couldn't go into stasis without saying goodbye to him. They'd hardly spoken as the months had passed, just small talk or the necessary conversations relating to ship's business. He'd seemed okay, but whenever they spoke, it was like he'd been holding something back. But then maybe the same had been true of her. He emerged onto the walkway.
Carina,
She stepped quickly toward him and fell into his arms. For several moments she couldn't speak. Bryce also said nothing.
I just had to see you before you...
I know. I'm glad you came. She luxuriated in his embrace, wishing she could stand here forever. When do you go in?
In a couple of hours.
His hug tightened.
Stay safe, okay? I couldn't bear it if I never saw you again.
Me neither.
Then why the distance between us? I mean, I do understand why, what you're afraid of, but what you think isn't true. You're too hard on yourself.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I think I can see that now. She felt like she was drowning, choking. She had never doubted how much she loved him. It was because of that she'd kept him away. But maybe she'd been wrong. Or was she being selfish, wanting to be with him knowing he would end up hurt? Holding him felt too good. She had to break away or she might never manage it. I have to go.
I know.
His arms slipped away as he looked her intently in the eyes.
When we wake up, we'll try again, right?
Anxiety and doubt rushed up from her stomach, but she swallowed them down. Yes, let's try. He grinned, leaned forward and kissed her lips.
It'll be like waking up tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?
Then he turned and strode away. When he reached the deck, he waved before leaving the chamber. Her apprehension eased, Carina faced the capsule once more. If she didn't survive stasis, at least she had made her peace with the people she loved. She took off her clothes, folded them, and placed them on a shelf next to the opening. She put her flask of elixir on the top of the pile, though she was unsure if the liquid would remain effective for years. Sit down and wait. That's the trigger that activates the deep sleep process. The chamber does the rest. That's what the tech had said. She climbed in. The base was smooth and cool under her bare feet. A soft hum sounded. The outer half of the shell swung inward and closed with a snick. She was shut inside the small space. She was not unconscious. Why wasn't she unconscious yet? Panicking, she tried to stand up, but her head hit the ceiling. Why wasn't stasis working? Was it because she was a mage? Other apparatus hadn't worked on her in the past, like the weapon she'd stolen on Banner's moon when she'd been working for the Shurers. It had incapacitated all the other soldiers with terror, but she had felt no effects. If the process wasn't working for her due to her difference from other humans, that would mean it hadn't worked for her mage siblings. She had thought they were in deep sleep, but they could be dead, drowned in nutrient. She braced herself against the inner wall and kicked the outer shell with both feet, but the seal remained firmly intact. The tiny nozzles sprang to life, spraying her in a cool, viscous liquid. Carina screamed, and then knew no more. Chapter 20. She awoke freezing, wet and naked. Hands were grabbing her, hauling her. She writhed, trying to break free, and slipped, landing hard on a cold metal surface. Her sodden hair hung in ropes over her face, blocking her vision. Her eyes weren't working properly anyway. Everything looked blurry, and all she could hear sounded muffled and distant. She could make out shouting and cries of pain and distress, but they were distorted as if listening through glass. She tried to stand, tried to get a grip on the smooth floor, but the mucousy liquid coating made her slip again. Then a massive hand fastened on her shoulder, and brute strength forced her downward until she squirmed on her stomach.
"Stay down,"
a deep husky voice breathed hotly in her ear.
"Stay still if you know what's good for you."
She knew that hand, that voice, Papu. Lo Mang and Mezban had escaped stasis. The giant had gained his freedom, and he was back to his old state, all submissiveness gone now his brother and Mezban were in charge again. She stopped struggling, knowing her efforts were pointless against Papu's brawn. She squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again several times, trying to make them work. The nutrient fluid had seeped under her lids and covered her eyeballs, but her vision problems were more than that. She hadn't used her eyes since entering stasis, possibly as long as 5 years ago. Her right cheek pressed against the walkway, and her hair drooped over her face. She lifted a hand to move it away and was rewarded by renewed pressure on her back from Papu. She grunted and dragged her hair from her eyes. The opposite side of the deep sleep chamber was revealed to her, though the lights bloomed into fuzzy pale yellow suns, and the lines of the walkways and capsules were undefined. Figures moved along the walkway, opening capsules and pulling out their occupants. Sounds were becoming clearer. The voices were speaking a foreign language. That was partly why she hadn't been able to make out what they were saying. Yet when she concentrated harder, she found she did understand them. They were speaking the language of the Bathsheba.
"Here he is,"
someone shouted.
"You're sure?"
a voice replied. Lo Mang.
"Yes, I recognize him." "Fine,"
Lo Mang said.
"Do it before he comes around."
A horrible, sickening crunch resounded, followed by the dull thump of a limp body hitting the deck. It sounded like someone had died. Who was he? Who had Lo Mang ordered to be killed? She fought to rise.
"Stay where you are,"
Papu barked in universal speech. "Get off me, you bastard! Let me up! If any of you have hurt one of my brothers—"
"It was not your brother,"
Papu hissed.
"I'm telling you, if you value your life and your family's lives, do not move."
Carina collapsed, forcing down despair. If it wasn't Fern or Darius, could it have been Bryce? People were moving on the walkway opposite, men and women in uniform. She finally recognized Mezban's troops were forcing the groggy and disoriented mercs to their feet and attempting to march them out of the chamber. though many could barely walk. Papu's large hand was an implacable force on her back, pressing her down so hard she was having trouble breathing. "Darius!" she called out. "Fern! Parthenia! Any of you! Are you okay?"
Your siblings are not here. Be quiet, or I will make you quiet.
She knew too well how easily Papu could make good on his promise, so she stopped resisting. For now, as soon as she got hold of some elixir, she would put everything right again. Only this time, Lomang, Mesban, Papu, and the rest of their troops, too, would be spaced. When the chamber seemed mostly empty and her vision and hearing had returned somewhat, the pressure on her back lifted and Papu's paw fastened around her biceps. He hoisted her to her feet with the ease of picking up trash from the floor. As soon as she was upright, however, she immediately collapsed. Her legs couldn't bear her weight. They felt like jelly, and as she looked down, she saw her thigh muscles were wasted. Papu lifted her again and began dragging her toward the steps. She stumbled, trying to get her legs underneath her as her feet scraped along the floor. She was now shivering in the cool chamber, all the residual heat from the stasis capsule fluid dissipating, as she had been forced to wait for the others to leave. Then she saw him. She screamed. The meagre strength in her lower limbs evaporated, and she hung limp in the giant's grasp, sobbing. A few meters in front of her lay a man's body, utterly still. The back of his head had been destroyed, and his sightless eyes gazed upward. Cadwallader was dead. Before he'd even had time to properly return to consciousness, Lomang's order had ripped the man's life from him.
Stand up,
Papu ordered.
Yes, your commander was executed. What did you expect? If it weren't for your powers, you would be dead too. Now, move.
Grief enveloped her. The lieutenant colonel had been a hard man and difficult to get to know, but his position dictated it. He'd always been honourable, principled, and self-sacrificing, and she'd glimpsed another side of him, a softer side. If they'd had more time, she might have gotten to know him well, and that would have been to her benefit, not his. But now that time would never come. The next few minutes passed in a blur as the giant yanked her the rest of the length of the walkway, past Cadwallader's body, down the stairs, and out of the chamber. She felt like an animal on a leash, only the leash was her arm and the collar was her shoulder. Papu's grip was a band of iron around her biceps, cutting off the blood from the rest of the limb. Suddenly, rage flared up. "Where is my family? Where's Bryce? If you've hurt them, I'll kill all of you." She tried to wrench herself free, but even if she hadn't been in her weakened state, her strength was no match for the giant's. Instead, she bit his hand, grinding her teeth into his flesh. Papu roared. He let go of her, and she dropped like a bag of stones. His bloody hand drew back and then swept toward her. His knuckles cracked against her jawbone, snapping her head around. The world receded, turning black. As she edged back from unconsciousness, she became vaguely aware of pain emanating from her face, but she leapt at the giant, power surging miraculously into her wasted legs. Papu caught her deftly by the throat and lifted her up. She dangled like a doll, choking, fingers scrabbling uselessly at the giant's thick digits.
Ah, little lady, how I would love to squeeze the life out of you.
He drew her closer.
I haven't forgotten how you left me in the grip of the mech. You poured shame on me, purposefully, and one day I will make you pay. Slowly.
He lowered her until the tips of her toes brushed the floor.
But today is not that day.
His hand left her throat, but before she could collapse, he lifted her by the waist and slotted her under his arm.
Be warned, you belligerent woman. I may not be at liberty to kill you, but I can make you suffer.
As she hung awkwardly in Papu's grasp, she tried to think of another way to hurt him, but then she remembered Bryce's words when Lo Mang's men had first surprised them on Ostalon. He had pleaded with her, telling her to stop fighting, that she was going to get herself killed. He had been right, and the same applied now. Expending the little energy she had on resisting Papu was pointless and dangerous. She would wait, find out what was happening and what Lo Mang and Mezban intended. Then, at the right moment, she would strike. This time there would be no mercy. The end. This has been Accursed Space, Star Mage Saga Book 5, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next book in the Star Mage Saga series is Flight from Sanctuary, Star Mage Saga Book 6. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.